Warriors of Old Japan and Other Stories by Y. T Ozaki, Part 1. Hachiro Tametomo, the Archer. Long, long ago there lived in Japan a man named Hachiro Tametomo, who became famous as the most skillful archer in the whole of the realm at that time. Hachiro means the eighth, and he was so called because he was the eighth son of his father, General Tameyoshi of the House of Minamoto. Yoshitomo, who afterwards became such a great figure in Japanese history, was his elder brother. Tametomo was therefore uncle to the shogun Yoritomo and the hero Yoshitsune, of whom you will soon read. He belonged to an illustrious family indeed. As a child, Hachiro gave promise of being a very strong man, and as he grew older this promise was more than fulfilled. He early showed a love of archery, and his left arm being 4 inches longer than his right, there was no one who could bend the bow better or send the arrow farther than he could. By nature, Hachiro was a rough, wild boy who did not know what fear was, and he loved to challenge his elder brothers to fight. He ever grew wilder as he grew older, till at last he acted so rudely and willfully, expecting and obeying no one set over him, that even his own father found him unmanageable. Now it happened when Hachiro was 13 years old that a learned man, named Fujiwara no Shinsei, came to the palace of the emperor one day to give a lecture on a certain book. During the lecture he said that there could not be found in the whole of Japan a warrior whose skill in archery could match that of Kiyomori, the chief of the Terra clan, or of Yorimasa, the Minamoto knight. These 2 knights, though belonging to 2 different clans, were the best archers throughout the land. Now Hachiro, when he heard these words, laughed aloud in scorn and said, so that everyone might hear him, that Fujiwara no Shinsei was right about Yorimasa, but to call their enemy, that coward of a Kiyomori, a clever archer, only showed what a foolish and ignorant man Fujiwara no Shinsei was. This rude speech, so contrary to the rules of Japanese kurta, which commands young people to maintain a respectful and humble silence in the presence of their elders, made Fujiwara very angry. When the lecture was finished, he therefore sent for Tametomo and rebuked him sternly for his behavior, but the daring Tametomo, instead of being ashamed of his unmannerly conduct and prostrating himself in apology before the learned man, would not listen to anything he had to say, and was so boisterous in declaring that he was right that Fujiwara gave up his task of correction as a hopeless one. But the lad's father, Tameyoshi, when he heard of what had happened, was very angry with his son for daring to dispute with his elder and superior, especially in the sacred precincts of the palace. He was so wroth indeed that at last he refused to see him or to keep him any longer under his roof, and to punish him, he sent him far away from his home to the island of Kyushu, now Tametomo. But like the willful, headstrong boy that he was, did not mind his banishment at all. On the contrary, he felt like a hound let loose from the leash, and rejoiced in his liberty, even though he had incurred his father's displeasure. When he reached the island of Kyushu, he made his way to the province of Higo, and finally settled down in the plain of Kumamoto. Now that Tametomo found himself free to do just as he liked, his thirst for conflict became so great that he could not restrain himself. He gathered round him a band of fighters as wild as himself, and challenged the men in all the neighboring provinces to come out and match their strength against his. In 20 battles which followed this challenge, Tametomo was never once defeated, so great was his strength and his cleverness in directing his soldiers. He was like a silkworm eating up the mulberry tree. Just as the silkworm devours one leaf after another, with slow but sure relentlessness, so Tametomo fought and fought the inhabitants of the provinces round about, till he had brought them all into subjection under him. By the time he was 18 years old, he had made himself chief of a large band of outlaws, distinguished for their reckless bravery, and with them he had mastered the whole of Kyushu, the western part of Japan. It was now that the name of Chinsei was given him on account of his having conquered the West. Chin means to put down, and sei means the West. Tidings traveled slowly in those days, for there were no railways or telegraph wires forming a network of lightning-speed communication across the land, and all carrying of news was done on foot, by messengers. So it was a long time before the government at the capital heard of the wild and lawless doings of Chinsei Hachiro Tametomo. But at last, his daring exploits became known, and the government decided to interfere and to put a stop to his outlawry. They sent a regiment of soldiers to hunt him down and take him prisoner, but Tametomo and his band were not only strong and fearless, but sharp of wit, and in the frequent skirmishes that took place, they always came out victorious. At last, the soldiers gave up their task of capturing him, for they found it impossible to overcome him and nothing would make Tametomo surrender. So the general returned to the capital and confessed his expedition had failed. The government now decided to arrest the outlaw's father, Tameyoshi, and so try to bring the rebel to bay. Tameyoshi was therefore seized and punished for being the parent of such an incorrigible rebel. Now, even the willful Tametomo was moved and distressed when he heard of what had happened to his father because of him. Although he was undisciplined by nature and ever ready to rebel against all authority, yet hidden deep in his heart there was till a sense of duty to his father, and on this his enemies had counted. He knew that it was inexcusable to let his father suffer punishment for his misdoings. As soon as the bad tidings reached him, he gave up without the least hesitation all the land in Kyushu, which had cost him several years of hard fighting to wrest from the inhabitants, and taking with him only 10 of his men with all the speed he could make, he went up to the capital. As soon as he reached the city, he sent in a document, signed and sealed in his blood, asking pardon of the government for all his former offenses, and begging that his father might be released at once. He then waited calmly and quietly for his sentence of punishment to be declared. Now, when those in authority saw his filial piety and his good conduct at this crisis, they could not find it in their hearts to treat him with severity. Even this man who has behaved like a demon can feel so. Much for his father, they exclaimed, and merely rebuking him for his lawlessness, they handed him over to his father, whom they had set free. At this time civil war broke out in the land, for 2 brothers, sons of the late ex-emperor T Oba, aspired to sit on the imperial throne. Owing to the favoritism of their father, the elder brother, Sudoku, was forced to abdicate and retire, while Goshirakawa, the younger brother, was put on the throne. On his deathbed, the ex-emperor Toba, also called the Pontiff Emperor, had foreseen that there would be strife between the two, and left sealed instructions in case of emergency. On opening this document, it was found to contain a command to all the principal genera was to support Goshirakawa. Hence the great chief of the Terra, Kiyomori, and Tametomo's eldest brother, Yashitomo, indeed all the warriors of repute and strength, supported Goshirakawa, while such nobles as Yorinaga and Fujiwara no Shinsei, who knew nothing of fighting, sided with the retired Emperor Sudoku. Yorinaga, it is said, could not mount his horse. Indeed, the only efficient soldiers on Sudoku's side were Tameyoshi and his 7 young sons, Tametomo, the reformed rebel, amongst them. Sudoku was told of Tametomo's strength and wonderful skill as an archer, and was advised to make use of him, so Tametomo was summoned ere long to the ex-emperor's presence. Tametomo was now just 20 years of age. He was more than 7 feet in height. His eyes were sharp and piercing like those of a hawk, and he carried himself with great pride and noble bearing. As he entered the imperial audience hall, so strong and brave and such a fine soldier did he look, that Sudoku at once felt confidence in him, and without delay consulted the young knight about the impending war. Then Tametomo told the emperor of how, when he had been banished to the west by his father, he had lived the life of an outlaw for many years. All that time his hand had been raised against everyone, and everyone had fought against him. It had been his delight and pastime to fight all who opposed his being lord of Kyushu. He and his band had always conquered, he said, because they had always fought at night. It would be a good plan, he thought, for Sudoku and his men to attack the palace of Goshirakawa by night, to set fire to the palace on 3 sides, and to place soldiers on the 4th side to seize the new emperor and his party when they tried to escape. If the ex-emperor would follow his advice, Tametomo said he felt sure that he would win the victory. Renaga, who was attending the council when he heard Tametomo's plan, shook his head in disapproval, and said that Tametomo's scheme of attack was an inferior one, that in his opinion it was a coward's trick to attack by night, and that it was befitting brave soldiers to fight by day in the ordinary way. When Tametomo saw that his advice was overruled, and that Sudoku's council would not follow his tactics, he left the palace. When he reached home, he told his men of all that had passed, and added in his anger that Yorinaga was a conceited fellow who knew nothing of fighting, though he had dared to give his worthless opinion and to contradict him, Tametomo, who had fought without once being beaten, all his life long. Thus giving vent to his disappointment, Tametomo seated himself on the mats, and as his anger passed away, he added with a sigh, "I only fear that Sudoku will be defeated in the coming struggle." Had Tametomo's tactics been followed, Japanese history would certainly have been different, for Kiyomori and Yoshitomo won a victory by the very plan which Tametomo had advised Sudoku to follow. At night, without any warning, the enemy made an attack on the ex-emperor's palace. The wary Tametomo, however, expected an assault and had stationed himself at the south gate on guard. On seeing Kiyomori and his band approaching, he exclaimed, "You feeble worms, I'll surprise you," and, aching his bow and arrow, shot a samurai named Ito Roku through the breast. The arrow was shot with such skill and force that it went right through the soldier's body, and coming out through his back, pierced the sleeve of the armor of Ito Go, his younger brother, who was riding close behind him. Ito Go, when he saw the precision and strength with which the arrow was shot, knew that they had to deal with no common foe, and in alarm carried the arrow to his general, Kiyomori, to show it to him. Kiyomori examined the arrow carefully and found that it was made from a strong bamboo of more than the usual thickness, and that the metal head was like a big chisel, a formidable weapon indeed. It was so large that it resembled a spear more than an arrow, and even the redoubtable Kiyomori trembled at the sight of it. This looks more like the arrow of a demon than of a man. Let us find another place of assault where our enemies are weaker, and where the leaders are not such remarkable marksmen, said he. Kiyomori then retired from the attack on the south gate. When Yoshitomo, who was now supporting Kiyomori, though later on he left the Terra chief, heard of his brother Tametomo's wooings, he said, "Tametomo may be a daredevil and boast of his skill as an archer, but he will surely not take up his bow and arrow against the person of his elder brother." And he took Kiyomori's place at the south gate of the palace. Which Tametomo was guarding. Drawing near the great roofed gate, Yoshitomo called aloud to Tametomo and said, "Is that you, Tametomo, on guard there? What a wicked deed you commit to fight against your elder brother. Now quickly open the gate and let me in. Tametomo, do you hear? I am Yoshitomo. Retire there." Tametomo laughed aloud at his elder brother's command and answered boldly, "If it is wrong for me to take up arms against you, my brother, are you not it an undutiful son to take up arms against your father?" Tameyoshi, his father, was fighting on the ex-emperor's side. Yoshitomo had no words wherewith to answer his brother and was silent. Tametomo, with his archer's eye, saw what a good mark his brother made just outside the gate, and he was greatly tempted to shoot at him even for sport. But he said that though war found them fighting on opposite sides, yet they were brothers, born of the same mother, and that it would be acting against his conscience to kill or hurt his own brother, for surely he would do so if he took aim seriously. He would, however, for the sake and love of sport, continue to show Yoshitomo what a clever marksman he was. Taking aim at Yoshitomo's helmet, Tametomo raised his bow and shot an arrow right into the middle of the star that topped it. The arrow pierced the star, came out the other side, and then cut through a wooden gate 5 or 6 inches in thickness. Even Yoshitomo was astonished at the skill which his brother displayed by this feat of archery. He now led his soldiers forward to the attack. But Sudoku's army was far outnumbered by the enemy, who swept down upon the palace in overwhelming numbers, and though Tametomo fought bravely and with great skill, his strength and valor were of no avail against the great odds which assailed him. The enemy gained ground slowly, inch by inch, till at last the gates were battered down, and they ruthlessly entered the palace. Calamity was added to calamity. The foe set fire to several parts of the building, and great confusion ensued. The ex-emperor, in making a vain attempt to escape with Yorinaga, was caught and taken prisoner. Seeing that for the present there was nothing to be done, Tametomo, with his father Tameyoshi and his other brothers, all loyal to Sudoku's cause, made good their escape and fled to the province of Omi. Tameyoshi was an old man unable to endure the hardships of a hunted life, and he found that he could go no further. So he told his sons that, as the emperor had been taken prisoner, and as there was no hope of raising Sudoku's flag again, at any rate for the present, it would be wiser for them all to return to the capital and surrender themselves to the conquerors, the Terra. They all agreed to this proposal except Tametomo. So Tameyoshi, the aged general, and the rest of his sons went back to Kyoto. Now Tametomo was left behind, alone in his brave resolution to fight another battle for the ex-emperor Sudoku. As soon as he had parted, sad and determined, from his father and brothers, he made his way towards the eastern provinces. But unfortunately, as he was journeying, the wound he had received in the recent fight became so painful that he stopped at some springs along the route, with the hope that the healing waters, a panacea for so any ills in Japan, would heal his hurt. But while taking the cure, his enemies came upon him and made him prisoner, and he was sent back a captive to the capital. By the time Tametomo reached the city, his father and his brothers had been put to death, and he was soon told that he was to meet the same cruel fate. But courage always arouses chivalry in the hearts of friends and foes alike, and it seemed to Tametomo's enemies a pity to put such a brave man to death. In the whole land, there was no man who could match him in bending the bow and sending the arrow home to its mark, so it was decided to spare his life at the last moment. But to prevent him from using his wonderful skill against them, his enemies cut the sinews of both his arms and sent him away to the island of Ashima off the coast of the province of Idzudo live. Lest he should escape on the way, they bound him hand and foot and put him in a palanquin. He was surrounded by a guard of 50 men, and so big and heavy was he that 20 bearers were required to carry the palanquin. In spite of all the misfortunes that had befallen him, he carried the same courage, the same stout merry heart, a same love of wildness with him, even into exile. As the 20 men carried him along in the palanquin, Tametomo, just for fun, would now and again put forth all his strength. So great was his weight then that the 20 bearers would stagger and fall to the ground. These feats of strength alarmed the escort of 50 soldiers. They feared lest he should act more savagely and become unmanageable, past their power of control, so they treated him in much the same way as they would have treated a lion or a tiger. They tried not to anger him, but did their utmost to keep him in a good humor during the journey. At last, they reached the province of Idzu and the seashore, from whence they had to cross over to the isla. And here they hired a boat, and putting Tametomo safely on board, they took him to his last destination and left him there. Though Tametomo was banished to this island, yet once there his enemies left him free to do much as he liked. He was not treated as a common prisoner, but as a brave though vanquished foe. The simple islanders recognized in him a great man and behaved to him accordingly, and listened to everything he chose to say. So he led an unmolested life, free from care, except the sorrow of being an exile, but his was a nature which took life as it came, without worrying about what he could not help. Now, one day Tametomo was standing on the beach gazing out to sea, thinking of them any adventures he had passed through, and wondering if fate would ever bring any change in the quiet life he was leading, when he saw a seagull come flying over the water. At first, Tametomo, with his keen eyes, saw only a speck in the distance. But the speck grew larger and larger till at last the seabird appeared. Tametomo now guessed that there was an island lying in the direction from which the bird came. So he got into a boat and set out on a voyage of discovery. He expected he came to an island after sailing from sunrise to sundown. To his amazement, he found the place inhabited by creatures very different from human beings. They had dark red faces, with shocks of bright red hair, the locks of which hung over their foreheads and eyes. They looked just like demons. A whole crowd of these alarming-looking creatures were standing on the beach when Tametomo landed. When they caught sight of him, they talked and gesticulated wildly. Amongst themselves and with fierce looks, they rushed towards him. Tametomo saw at once that they meant him harm, but he was nothing daunted. He went up to a large pine tree that was growing nearby, laid his hands on it, and uprooting it with as much ease as if it were a weed, he brandished it over his head and called aloud threateningly, "Come, you demons, fight if you will. I am Shinsei Hachiro Tametomo, the archer of Great Japan. If you will henceforth become my servants and look up to me as master in all things, it is well. Otherwise I will beat you all to little pieces." When the demons saw Tametomo's great strength and his fearlessness, they trembled. They held a short parley amongst themselves. And then the demon chief stepped forward, followed by all his band. They came in front of Tametomo, and prostrating themselves before him on the sand, they one and all surrendered. Tametomo, with much pride, took possession of this island of demons and made himself monarch of all he surveyed. Having subdued the demons, he returned to Oshima with the news. Great was the praise and merit awarded him by all the islanders. Another day, soon after this, Tametomo was walking on the sands of the seashore when he saw coming towards him, floating nearer and nearer on the top of the waves, a little old man. Tametomo could hardly believe his sight. He had never seen anything so strange in his whole life. He rubbed his eyes, thinking he must be dreaming, and looked again. There sure enough was a tiny man, no bigger than 1 foot 5 inches high, sitting gracefully on a round straw mat, filled with wonder. Tametomo walked to the edge of this. And as the little creature floated nearer on an incoming wave, he said, "Who are you?" "I am the microbe of smallpox," answered the stranger pygmy. "And why, may I ask, do you come to this island?" inquired Tametomo. "I haven't ever been here before, so I came partly for sightseeing and partly with the desire to seize hold of the inhabitants," answered the little creature. Before he could finish his sentence, Tametomo said angrily, "You spirit of hateful pestilence! Silence, I say! I am no other than Shinsei Hachiro Tametomo. Get out of my presence at once and take yourself far from this place, or I will make you repent the day you ever came here." As Tametomo spoke, the smallpox microbe shrank from the form of a tiny man 1 foot 5 inches high, till only something the size of a pea was left in the middle of the straw mat. As he dwindled and dwindled, the little creature said that he was sorry that he had intruded into the island, but he had not known that it was in Tametomo's possession. And he then floated away out to sea on his straw mat as quickly and mysteriously as he had come. The island of Oshima has always been free from smallpox, and to this day the islanders ascribe the immunity they enjoy from the horrible pestilence to Tametomo, who drove away the microbe when the hateful creature would have landed there. Now that Tametomo had subdued the demons on the neighboring island and had driven away the spirit of smallpox from Oshima, he was looked upon as a king by the simple islanders. They rendered him every possible honor and bowed their heads in the dust before him whenever he went abroad. At last, this state of affairs was reported to the authorities in the capital. The ministers of state decided that it was unsafe to allow this to go on. Such a popular and powerful hero was a menace to the government. Tametomo, the champion, archer, must be put down and without delay. Such was the decree. A messenger was then, and there dispatched with sealed orders to General Shigemitsu in Idzu to set sail with his men for Oshima and subdue Tametomo. one day Tametomo was standing on the beach and watching with pleasure, as he often did, the ever-whispering sea laughing and sparkling in the sunshine, when he saw 50 war junks coming towards the island. The soldiers standing on the 50 decks were all armed, with swords and bows and arrows, and clad in armor from head to foot, and they were beating drums and singing martial songs. Tametomo smiled when he saw this fleet all mustered in martial array, and sent against him, a single man for. He knew, somehow or other, what they had come for. Now, he said proudly to himself, the opportunity is given me of trying my archer's skill once more. Seizing his bow, he pulled it to the shape of a full moon and aiming it at the fore. Most ship sent an arrow right into the prow. In an instant the boat was upset and the soldiers pitched into the sea. Till that moment, Tametomo had feared that his arm had lost its first great strength, since his enemies had cut the sinew. But on the contrary, he now found that not only were his arms as strong as ever, but that they had even grown longer, and that he was able to pull his bow wider than before. He clapped his hands with joy at the discovery, and called aloud, "This is a happy thing." But now Tametomo reflected that if he fought against those who had been sent by the government to take him, he would only bring trouble on the people of the island who had been so kind to him and who had sheltered him in his exile. He thought of how in their simple reverence for his great strength they had almost worshipped him as a deified hero and had looked up to him as their leader. No, he would not, could not, bring war and trouble and certain punishment upon these good folk, so for their sake he decided not to fight more. He looked back with the keen flight of thought that comes to mortals in moments of great crises, and he remembered how with special mercy his life had been spared when he was taken prisoner in the Civil War. Since then, he had enjoyed life for over 10 years. As a strong, brave man, he could not grudge losing it now. He had made himself owner of the islands, and the people called him their king. He felt that there was no shame or regret in dying when he had reached the height of his glory. Therefore, with firm and quick decision, he made up his mind to die. He withdrew at once from the beach and retired to his house. And here he committed suicide by harakiri, thus saving himself from all dishonor and the islanders from all trouble. He was only 32 years of age when he died. His death was greatly regretted by all who loved him. But his glory did not die with him. The people ever afterward honored and reverenced him as a great hero. Such is one story of the death of Tametomo, but legend has created another, still more interesting about him. Instead of taking his own life, this tradition says that he escaped from Oshima and reached Sanuki. Here he visited the late emperor's tomb and offered up prayers for the illustrious dead. He then, believing that his day of usefulness was over, prepared to kill himself, when suddenly, as in a dream, the emperor, Yorinaga, his father, and all those royalists who had fought and died in the Civil War, or had been taken prisoners and killed by the victorious parties of the new emperor, appeared to him in a clouds, and with a warning gesture prevented him from committing the dread deed of harakiri. As Tametomo gazed wonderingly at the beautiful vision, the bamboo curtain which hung before the ex-emperor's palanquin lifted, and as the sun shone in grace of his majesty's smile fell upon the awe-stricken man, the sword dropped from his hand, and the wish to die expired in his breast. He fell forward in humble prostration to the ground. When Tametomo lifted his head, the vision had vanished within the clouds. Nothing remained to be seen of the royal array which had saved him from his self-imposed death. This wonderful visitation changed Tametomo's mind. He gave up all idea of seeking death, and, leaving Sanuki, journeyed to Kyushu and took up his abode on Mount Kahara. Here he collected a band of followers, and with them embarked on board a ship with the intention of reaching the capital, and once more striking a blow at the arrogant and usurping house of Terra. But misfortune followed him. He was overtaken by a storm, his ship was wrecked, his men lost, while he only narrowly escaped with his life to the island of Ryukyu. Here he found the people in a state Great excitement, for a party of rebels had risen against the king, who was greatly oppressed by them. Tametomo put himself at the head of the loyalists, rescued the king, who had been taken prisoner, subdued the rebels, and then restored peace to the disturbed land. For these meritorious services, the king adopted him as his son, bestowed upon him the title of prince, and married him to one of the royal princesses. At last one day, when Tametomo had reached a good old age, happy in the life of peace and bliss with which his later years had been crowned, as he was walking along one of the spacious verandas of the palace, his attendants noticed a trail of cloud coming towards their master from the sky. As the cloud touched Tametomo, he began to rise in the air before their astonished gaze. Lost in speechless amazement, they watched the hero mount higher and higher, till the clouds closed round him and hid him from their view. The pretty legend of the earthly end of the brave archer Tametomo, one of the most interesting figures in Japanese history, who conquered the trials and misfortunes of his youth and won through to bright days of prosperity. He left us, uncalled Shuntenno, who became king of Ryukyu in due time. Sanmi Yorimasa, the knight. Long, long ago in Japan, there lived a brave knight named Sanmi Yorimasa. Yorimasa was his own name, while Gen was the great clan to which he belonged, the Genji or Minamoto, famous in history. And Sanmi showed that he was a knight of the third rank at court, from the word san, which means three. Now Yorimasa is so celebrated a warrior that to this day, his picture is painted on the kites which the little boys of Japan fly at the New Year. And if you visit the Temple of the Goddess of Mercy at Asakusa in Tokyo, you will see his portrait even there. And at the Boys' Festival, on the 5th of the 5th month, when in every household where there are sons the favorite heroes of the land are set out in the alcove of honor of the guest room, you will surely find amidst the martial show of toys the figure of an archer clothed from head to foot in gay armor, with a huge bow in his hand and a quiver full of arrows on his back. That is Yorimasa of brave and dear memory. Yorimasa was the 5th descendant of the great knight Reiko, who killed the demons of Oiyama, about whom you will soon read. As a youth, Yorimasa was noted for his valor and his skill in archery, and he was soon called to the court and given the important post of chief guard of the imperial palace. Now, though Yorimasa was a man of ability and the greatest archer of his time, and though he had done deeds of note which had brought him into prominence, yet for some unaccountable reason his rank at court remained stationary, and he did not advance from the 4th degree, which he had when he first entered the sacred precincts of the palace. The humor of the situation caught Yorimasa's fancy, for he was very quick-witted, and one day, smiling to himself, he sat down at his writing table and composed a poem lamenting his bad luck. From the earliest ages, the Japanese have trained themselves, at the times when their feelings are stirred by some event which causes happiness or sorrow or disappointment, not to give way to their emotions, but to control their minds sufficiently to compose a poem on the subject. Yorimasa's poem was of 31 syllables, and in 5 short lines he said gracefully that one who has not the means of climbing upwards remains under the tree and passes his life in picking up beechnuts. Now in Japanese, the word for beechnuts is shiai, and this word also means the 4th rank at court, so that the couplet was a pun on his not being promoted. Yorimasa read the poem laughingly to some of his friends, and they, admiring his wit, repeated it and talked about it till it became quite famous in the palace, and at last reached the emperor's ear. The sympathy of his majesty was aroused, and soon after, this Yorimasa was raised to the rank of the 3rd degree Sanmi, and by this title he has ever afterwards been known. Now it happened that at this time the emperor became ill and could not sleep at night. He complained of disturbance and a its sense of oppression from sunset to sunrise. His courtiers, full of anxiety, sat up to watch the night through, see if they could discover the cause of the emperor's agitation. Some kept vigil in and round the imperial chamber, others on ideved verandas, and some in the courtyard of the palace. Then the watchers on the verandas and in the courtyard noticed that as soon as the sun set, a black cloud came from the eastern horizon of the capital, and traveling across the city finally rested on the roof of the palace called the Purple Hall, Shishinden, of the North Star where the emperor slept. As soon as this cloud alighted on the palace, the emperor's sleep became disturbed as if by frightful nightmare. Those in attendance round the royal bed heard strange scratchings and noises on the roof, as if some dreadful beast were there. These unusual sounds and the nightmare of the imperial sleeper lasted till dawn, when it was noticed that the black cloud always withdrew. Now in the palace there was great commotion. The minister of the right and the minister of the left, whose duty it was to guard the emperor from all harm, held long and anxious consultation as to what should be done. Everyone in the palace was of the opinion that the black cloud hid some monster which for some unknown cause haunted the emperor. It was quite certain that unless the monster were killed, and that soon, the emperor's life would be endangered, for he was growing weaker and thinner every day. The question was, who was brave enough to undertake the task? The palace sentinels were already scared, so it was useless to expect help from them. The ministers must seek for some brave samurai well known for his daring and his skill as an archer and put him on night duty, charging him to kill the monster as soon as it should appear. The courtiers, one and all, said that Yorimasa was the man. An imperial messenger was therefore at once sent to the knight with a letter telling him what was demanded of him. Yorimasa, when he read the letter, looked very grave, for he felt the responsibility of his new duty, which was different from all other work, for on him now depended the recovery of the emperor, who was visibly growing worse and living through each day in terror of the nightmare, which haunted him in the darkness. Yorimasa was a man of great courage and resource, and lost not a moment in getting ready. He strung his best bow most carefully, and placed his quiver in 2 steel-headed arrows. He then put on his armor, and over his armor he donned a hunting dress, and to look more courtly, he put on a ceremonial cap instead of a helmet. He chose his favorite retainer, the bravest and strongest of all his soldiers, to accompany him. Yorimasa now set out as calmly and quietly as if he were simply going to his everyday duty and nothing more. As soon as his arrival was made known, he was summoned to the presence of the ministers of the right and the left, and told of all that was happening at court, how every night at the hour of sunset, a black cloud was seen to issue from the east, approach the palace, and finally cover the roof of the Purple, all of the North Star where the emperor always slept. Then the ministers told the knight of the strange noises that were heard on the roof, of the howlings and scratchings which lasted all night till the dawn broke. It behoved him, they said, to do his best to kill the monster, if such it was, for all the guards were now thoroughly frightened, and none of them dared attack it in hand-to-hand fight, and none had skill enough to hit it in the dark, though the emperor's own bodyguard of archers had tried again and again. Yorimasa listened to the strange story gravely. He saw that the whole palace was in a state of alarm and disturbance, but he did not lose heart. With the greatest self-possession, he waited for the end of the day. As soon as the sun set, the night grew stormy. The wind blew a hurricane, the lightning flashed, and the thunder roared. Nothing daunted by the fury of the elements, the brave archer waited and waited. It must have been near midnight when Yorimasa saw a thick black cloud sweep down and settle on the roof of the palace. He bade his retainer be ready with sword and torch at any moment, and to follow him closely. The black cloud moved along the ridge of the gray-tiled roof till it stopped at the northeast corner, just over the imperial sleeping chamber. Yorimasa cautiously followed the movements of the cloud, his man just behind him. Straining his eyes, Yorimasa saw, during a vivid flash of lightning, the form of a large animal. Keeping his eyes on the spot where he had seen the head, while the peals of thunder crashed like cannon above. In the darkness which followed, he caught the glare first of one eye and then of the other as the creature moved along. "This must be the monster who disturbs the emperor's rest," said Yorimasa to himself. With these words, he fitted an arrow to the bow, and aiming to the left of where he saw the left eye glare, he pulled his bow, as round as the full moon, and lay. It fly. Yorimasa felt that his arrow had touched flesh. At the same moment there was a frightful howl and a heavy thud, and the writhing in agony of some animal on the ground, which showed that Yorimasa had done his work well. Now Yorimasa. His retainer rushed upon the monster. In one hand he held a blazing torch, in the other a short sword with which he stabbed the creature 9 times and quickly dispatched him. Then they both raised their voices and called to the sentinels and the courtiers to come and look. A strange sight was in store for them. Never had any of them seen anything like the monster that lay before them. The dreadful beast was as large as a horse. It had the head of an ape, the body and claws of a tiger, the tail of a serpent, the wings of a bird, and the scales of a dragon. They had heard and read of such creatures in some of the old books, but had always thought that such stories were old women's fables, to be told and whispered by gray-haired dames round the hibachi, fire brazier, to their wonder-struck grandchildren, but never to be entertained seriously by men of sense. For a few moments they were all struck dumb with astonishment. They gazed silently first at the strange and horrible beast before them, then at Yorimasa, the slayer of it. Exclamations of wonder burst from their lips. Then one and all turned to the brave archer and congratulated him on his wonderful feat, his courage and his marksmanship. It seemed as if they would never cease applauding him. The animal was flayed and its skin was carried to the emperor, who ordered it to be stored as a curiosity in the imperial treasure house. His Majesty was highly pleased. He sent for Yorimasa and bestowed on him a sword called Shishiwo, or the King of Lions. The time of the year was the beginning of the 5th month. The crescent moon hung like a silver bow in the twilight sky, and the cuckoo was calling from the trees nearby. So the minister of the left, who handed the sword to Yorimasa, improvised the first half of a stanza, saying, "O cuckoo of wonder, even your name climbs ever upward to the heaven." Then Yorimasa, on his knees with uplifted hand and bowed head, received the sword, and as he did so, he completed the short poem with these words: "Not through thine own, but through the merit of a moon-shaped bow." The minister used the cuckoo, then calling in the trees as simile of the brave warrior whose fame was rising now at court because of his brave deeds, and Yorimasa modestly answered that all was due not to his skill, but to his bow, which he likened to the crescent moon then reigning in the sky. Both turned to the scenery of the moment for inspiration, the minister in expressing his praise and the warrior in receiving it with becoming humility and grace. The emperor also considered this a fitting occasion to give Yorimasa the Lady Iris for his wife, and about this incident there is a pretty story. The Lady Iame was the most lovely lady-in-waiting in the palace, and as good as she was beautiful. Not only in beauty, but in mind and heart, was she superior to all the other ladies-in-waiting, and both the emperor and empress held her in high esteem. Many were the court nobles who fell in love with her, but all in vain. There was not one, however great or rich or handsome, who could make her so much as grant him even a fleeting smile. Time after time, these noble suitors wrote her letters and poems, telling her of their hopeless love and beseeching her to send them but a single line in reply. But only her silence answered them. She remained obdurate to all entreaties. One day Yorimasa, when on duty in the palace, caught a passing glimpse of the Lady Iame, and from that hour his heart knew no rest. He could not forget the witching grace nor the modest beauty of her lovely face. Sleeping or waking, the vision of his lady-love was always before his eyes, and it seemed to grow more vivid as the days went by. Time after time he wrote her letters and composed poems asking her to marry him, but the Lady Iame treated Yorimasa as she treated all her other wooers. She vouchsafed him no reply. For 3 long years, Yorimasa waited and hoped and despaired, and waited and hoped again, content if once in a way from a respectful distance he could catch a glimpse of her. In spite of long and cold discouragement, he loved her perseveringly. The emperor had heard of the knight's constancy, and now sent for his favorite lady-in-waiting, thinking this the right time to war. Yorimasa's prowess and the Lady Iame's merit, and to make them both happy. As soon as Iame appeared, His Majesty said, "Lady Iame, is it true that you have received many letters from the knight Yorimasa? Is it so?" At this the lady Iame blushed like a peach blossom in the glow of dawn, and hesitating a moment she replied, "May it please the Son of Heaven to condescend to send for Yorimasa and ask him." His Majesty then commanded her to retire, and forthwith summoned Yorimasa to his presence. It was the 5th of May, the spring festival, and Yorimasa came robed in gala attire. He presented himself below the dais on which the emperor was seated and prostrated himself before the throne. "Is it true," and the emperor smiled as he spoke, "that you love the Lady Iame?" Yorimasa was bewildered by the suddenness of the question and knew not what to reply, for he knew it to be strictly forbidden by court etiquette to write love letter to any lady-in-waiting, and he had done this persistently. Now the emperor saw Yorimasa's confusion and felt sorry for him. A bright thought struck His Majesty. He would please and puzzle Yorimasa and have some fun at his expense at same time as well. He whispered an order to the chief master of ceremony. In a short time 3 ladies appeared, heralded by attendants. As they moved across the mats of the immense hall, Yorimasa saw that they were all dressed exactly alike, and that even their hair was done in the same style, so that it would be impossible for anyone who did not know them well to distinguish one from the other. Who were they? Was the Lady Iame one of them? Like maidens of heaven, Tenin, D. The 3 noble damsels appear, and their robes were beautiful to behold. So alike were they, and their beauty so extraordinary, that Yorimasa compared them to plum blossoms on a branch seen through a window. "Lady Iame is here," said the emperor. "Choose her from among 3 ladies and take her." Yorimasa bowed to the ground. He was overcome with the graciousness and kindness of the emperor. But the task laid upon him he felt to be too difficult, being a military man and an inferior in rank to the court circle. Yorimasa had never had an opportunity of seeing any of the court ladies face to face. All he had seen of the Lady Iame was sometimes a glimpse of her from the courtyard, where he was stationed, and as she passed along the corridors of the palace. Once at a poetical party, to which he had been admitted as a great favor, he had seen her, at the further end of the hall, glide with trailing robes of ceremony into her place behind the silken screen which always hid the women from view at such gatherings. That was all he had ever seen of her, so that now he could not distinguish her from the rest. The emperor was pleased at the success of his pleasantry. He saw that Yorimasa was fairly perplexed, and that he was unable to pick out his lady-love from her companions. "I am a soldier and no courtier," thought the knight. "I may not presume to lift my eyes to a lady above the clouds, nor can I be sure. It is Iame. Were I to make a mistake and choose the wrong lady, it would be a lifelong disgrace and disappointment to me." The perplexity in his mind at once rose to his lips in the form of a short poem, which he repeated. "In the rainy season when the waters overflow the banks of the lake, who can gather the iris?" Such is the meaning of the verse. By the rainy season, Yorimasa meant his 3 years of hopeless courting, during which his eyes had become dim with the tears of disappointment he had shed, so that he could no longer see clearly enough to discover which was the lady of his choice. In this way he excused himself for his seeming stupidity, and showed a modest reserve which pleased all present. The aptness and quickness of Yorimasa's verse won the emperor's admiration. The tears stood in the august eyes, for he thought of the great love wherewith Yorimasa had loved the Lady Iris, and of the sorrow and patience of his long wooing and waiting. His Majesty rose from his throne, descended the steps of the dais, and going up to Iame took her by the hand and led her forth to Yorimasa. "This is the Lady Iame, I give her to you," were the golden words of the emperor to Yorimasa. So it must have seemed too wonderful almost to be true. The great desire of his life was given him by the emperor himself. Then Yorimasa led his beautiful lady-love away and married her, and we are told that they lived as happily as fish in water, and it seemed as if they had but one heart between them, so harmonious was their union. In the palace, there was great rejoicing over the auspicious event, and all the courtiers praised the merit of the verse, which had finally given. I aimed to Yorimasa and won the emperor's special commendation. The happy couple received the congratulations of the emperor and empress, of the courtiers and many noble people, and wedding presents innumerable. Surely at this time there was no unhappier than Yorimasa in all the land. There are many stories told of Yorimasa, which show us that he was not only a brave soldier, and a man of learning and a poet, but also a man of wit and tact who knew how to use men as he willed. Now one day, a band of discontented, turbulent priests came to the palace gate where Yorimasa was on guard, and demanded entrance. It must be explained that in those days, the Buddhist priests of Kyoto were a set of wild and lawless men who often brought shame to their religion by their wicked lives. They lived outside the city on Mount Hiei, which they made their stronghold, and, forgetting the dignity of their religion, they took sides in war and in politics. They gave trouble to those in authority, especially to those who did not favor them. They used the smallest event as an occasion for carrying swords and bows and arrows, and it was their habit to go out equipped like soldiers going forth to war. Yorimasa saw that the priests were all well armed and only too anxious to find a pretext for drawing their swords. They carried with them in great state the sacred palanquin of their temple. In this palanquin, their patron, Od, was supposed to dwell, and it was borne aloft on the shoulders of 50 men. With loud shoutings and a wild display of strength, the priests rushed the car along, now lifting it high above their heads, now staggering under its weight as it seemed about to crush them to the ground. Now Yorimasa was in no mood for fighting that day, and it seemed to him not worth his while to set his men, the best fighters and archers in the realm, against a handful of priests whom he could dismiss in a few minutes. Besides, these priests from Mount Hiei were troublesome fellows, and he did not wish to earn their enmity. So, laughing quietly to himself, he said that he would have some fun at their expense. When the procession stopped opposite at the gate, Yorimasa with his captains of the guard sallied forth to meet the noisy crowd, and coming in front of the palanquin bowed in reverence before it with slow ceremony. The priests, who had expected and were prepared for a very difficult reception, were surprised and somewhat taken aback. After some parley amongst themselves, their spokesman advanced and asked leave to enter the gate, saying they had a petition to present to the emperor. Yorimasa sent his captain forward. My lord bids you welcome, he said, and wishes me to say that he worships the same God as yourselves, and he is therefore averse to shooting against the Mikoshi sacred palanquin with his bows and arrows. Besides this, we are very few in number, so that your names will be dishonored, and you will be called cowards for having chosen the weakest post to fight. Now the next gate is guarded by the Hike soldiers, who are much stronger in numbers than we are. How would it do for you to go round and fight there? You would surely gain glory in an encounter with them. The priests were so pleased by the flattery of this speech that they did not see that it was a ruse on the part of Yorimasa to get rid of them easily, and that he was sending them round to bother his rivals. He had also appealed to their best feelings, for Japanese chivalry teaches that in the event of choosing between two enemies, the weaker must always be spared. Some polite answer was made to Yorimasa, and then the priests shouldered the Mikoshi and departed in the same spirited and vociferous manner that they had come. They went to the next gate, guarded by the Hike. Battle was given at once, for they were refused admittance. The priests were beaten and fled for their lives to the hills. All these stories show us that Yorimasa was a clever man in every way, but in the end he was unfortunate, and for this there was no help. When we read the story of his ill-fated death, our hearts are filled with sorrow for him. It is not always as one wishes in this world, and Yorimasa did not meet with the fate his meritorious deeds and character deserved. The Hike or Terra clan were now in the Asen. Yorimasa, it will be remembered, belonged to the Genji or Minamoto, and Kiyomori, their despotic and unprincipled leader, was prime minister. All the important posts in the government he gave to his sons, grandsons, and ril. Asians, who under these circumstances, seeing that they owed everything to him, did just as the tyrant ordered. All samurai who did not belong to the Hike clan he treated unjustly, even throwing those he did not like into prison, whether they were innocent or guilty of the crimes or behavior deserving such punishment. As a general of the rival Genji clan, Yorimasa suffered much from this unfair treatment. As he watched the arrogant conduct of Kiyomori and his Munemori, he longed to be able to punish them and to bring retribution on the whole clan. And to this end he thought and worked and planned. At last, the Hike became so overbearing and so powerful that their actions passed the bounds of all Rui. Izen and Kiyomori, on a question of succession to the throne, confined the reigning emperor in his palace. This last step was too much for Yorimasa. He could endure this state of things no longer, and he resolved to make a bold strap. For the right, he placed Prince Takakura, the son of the late emperor, at the head of his army and set out to do battle with the Hike. But the Genji were far inferior in numbers to the Hike, and sad to relate, Yorimasa was defeated in his good and just cause. With the remainder of his army, he fled before the enemy and took refuge in the temple of Byadoin, situated on the river Yuji. The Byadoin Temple, a large edifice near Kyoto, remains to this day. Yorimasa made a last stand to afford time for Prince Takakura to escape. He divided his men into two parties. One division he stationed as a reserve force in the grounds of the temple, while the other he drew up in battle along the banks of the river. In case of pursuit, to prevent the enemy from crossing the river, they tore up the planks which formed the flooring of the bridge, so that only a skeleton of posts and crossbeams remained. Then they rested and waited to see what would happen. The Hike soon came in sight, following hard after them. First came the generals, then the soldiers, 28,000 strong. They approached the bridge, but stopped short when they saw what the Genji had cleverly done. In a few minutes they ranged themselves along the bank facing the enemy. Both armies now stood confronting each other on either side of the Yuji. Simultaneously, the order was given to fight by both the Genji and the Hike Jenner. Ulls and a fierce discharge of arrows from both sides ensued. Then there rushed forth from the ranks of the Genji a huge priest, Tajima Bo by name. In those days, the Buddhist priests often took part in battles. Brandishing an enormous bird, he dashed out alone on the skeleton bridge. The Hike, thinking that he made an excellent target, shot a shower of arrows at him. But he was not in the least daunted when the arrows were aimed at his head. He stooped and they passed over him. When they were aimed at his legs, he jumped high in the air and they flew under him. When they were aimed at his body, he swept them aside with his halberd. And in this way he escaped free from hurt. So quick was he in his movement, and so marvelous was the way in which he balanced himself in his progress across the bridge, that he seemed to be endowed with power more than human. And not only his own comrades, but the enemy also looked at him in breathless admiration. Then another of Yorimasa's men, also a priest, Jamio by name, inspired by this example, came forth and stood up at the end of the bridge, and fitting his arrows to the bow, in rapid succession shot about a dozen of the foe, in the twinkling of an eye, crying out, "Oh, this is too much trouble." He threw away his bow and arrow and walked over the bridge on another beam, sweeping aside with his sword the arrows aimed at him. Yet another priest, famous for his gray strength, dashed out and followed after his friends across the bridge. He soon came up with Jamio, but as the beams of the bridge were narrow, he could not pass him. Stopping for a moment to think what he should do, he stretched out his hand and touched the helmet of the man just in front of him, then lightly and quickly jumped leapfrog over his head. The bridge was now soon swarming with the Genji, who with fierce battle cries began to attack the Hike, whose advance was intact. Early checked. For some minutes the Hike were greatly put out, not knowing what to do. Then one brave youth, seeing how matters stood, and that it required someone to take a dauntless lead, sprang forth in front of the Hike and called out, "Ow, that it comes to this, there is no other way." And with these words he dashed his horse into the river. It was the rainy season, and the waters were higher and the current stronger than usual. Black with mud, the river ran swirling and whirling on its course. Never was there a braver sight than when the young soldier drove his horse into the swollen river and made for the other side. His comrades could not stand still and watch him. Fired by his courage, numbers of the hike, shouting, "I all." So I also dashed in after him. In a few minutes, while the Genji looked on in surprise, 300 men had followed the gallant young captain, stemmed and crossed the torrent, and landed on the other side, and with the same dashing spirit. Harrying everything before them, they broke through the last lines of the Genji and entered the Byadoin temple, where their last stand was made. The Genji, with Yorimasa at their head, were now in a desperate condition, seeing his father hard press. Kanetsuna, Yorimasa's second son, an intrepid young knight, rushed into the thickest of the fight and tried to defend his father. A hike captain coming up with 15 of his men seized Kanetsuna, overpowered him, and cut off his head. Not one of Yorimasa's little band turned to flee. Although they knew there was no hope, they fought on face to face with the foe, for samurai traditions held it a disgrace to be even wounded in the back. One famous general in ancient history issued an order to the effect that prizes would be awarded to those who were shot in the forehead, but those who were wounded in the back should be slain. One by one, the Genji fell, slain either by sword or arrow. Yorimasa received several wounds. Then he saw that there was no use in fighting more. All was lost. Those of the Genji who were still left made a brave stand round their chief. While they kept the enemy at bay, Yorimasa slipped away and hastened to Prince Takakura in the temple and begged him to flee in safety while there was yet time. Having seen his imperial master safe, Yorimasa then retired to an inner part of the garden, and sitting under a large tree drew out his sword and prepared himself to commit harakiri, for samurai honor would not let him survive defeat. Calling his retainer Watanabe, who had escaped unhurt and who never left his master's side, Yorimasa bade him act as second in the right. Then quietly taking off his armor, he composed a poem. He likened himself to a fossil tree that never knows the joy of blossoming, for he had never attained his ambition, the destruction of his enemies. And sad indeed is the end of my life, the last line of the verse, were the last words he uttered. He took out his short sword, and thrusting it into his side died like a brave and gallant samurai, without a moan. Then from behind, as was his duty as and Watanabe cut off his master's head, and so that it should not be discovered by the enemy and carried away as a trophy of war. He tied a large stone to it, and with sorrowful reverence dropped it into the river and watched it sink beneath the water out of sight. In this way died Yorimasa. Those of his followers who were not killed by the enemy died by their own hand, and Prince Takakura, fleeing to Nara, was overtaken by the hike and put to death on the way. Yorimasa was 75 years of age when he died. Though, as he lamented in his last poem, he had not achieved his ambition in punishing the hike, yet years later his work was carried on, and the hike were completely exterminated. Yoritomo, the great chief and mighty avenger of the Genji, and the name of Sanmi Yorimasa lives forever in the history of his country. The story of Yoshitsune, in old Japan more than 700 years ago, a fierce war was raging between the two great clans, the Tara and the Minamoto, also called the Hike and the Genji. These two famous clans were always contesting together for political power and military supremacy, and the country was torn in two with the many bitter battles that were fought. Indeed, it may be said that the history of Japan for many years was the history of these two mighty martial families, sometimes the Minamoto, and sometimes the Tara gaining the victory, or being beaten, as the case might be, but their swords knew no rest for a period of many years. At last, a strong and valiant general arose in the house of Minamoto. His name was Yoshitomo. At this time, there were two aspirants for the imperial throne, and civil war was raging in the capital. One imperial candidate was supported by the Terra, the other by the Minamoto. Yoshitomo, though a Minamoto, sided at first with the Terra against the reigning emperor. But when he saw how cruel and relentless their chief, Kiyomori, was, he turned against him and called all his followers to rally round the Minamoto standard and fight to put down the Terra. But fate was against the gallant and doughty warrior Yoshitomo, and he suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Terra. He and his men, while fleeing from the vigilance of their enemies, were overtaken within the city gates and ruthlessly slaughtered by Kiyomori and his soldiers. Yoshitomo left behind him his beautiful young wife, Takiwa Gozen, and 8 children to mourn his untimely death. 5 of the elder children were by a first wife. The third of these became Yoritomo, the great first shogun of Japan, while the 8th and youngest child was Ushiwaka, about whom this story is written. Ushiwaka and the hero Yoshitsune were one and the same person. Ushiwaka, young ox, he was so called because of his wonderful strength, was his name as a boy. And Yoshitsune was the name he took when he became of age. At the time of his father's death, Ushiwaka was a babe in the arms of his mother, Takiwa Gozen. But his tender age would not have saved his life had he been found by his father. His enemies, after the defeat they had inflicted on the rival clan, the Terra, were all-powerful for a time. The Minamoto clan were in dire straits and in danger of being exterminated now, for so fierce was Kiyomori's hatred against his enemies that when a Minamoto fell into his cruel hands, he immediately put the captive to death. Realizing the great peril of the situation, Takiwa Gozen, the widow of Yoshitomo, full of fear and anxiety for the safety of her little ones, quietly hid herself in the country, taking with her Ushiwaka and her 2 other children. So successful was Takiwa Gozen in concealing her hiding place that, though the Terra clan either killed or banished to a faraway island, all the elder sons, relations, and partisans of the Minamoto chief, they could not discover the whereabouts of the mother and her children, notwithstanding the strict search Kiyomori had made. Determined to have his will, and angry at being warded by a woman, Kiyomori at last hit on a plan which he felt sure would not fail to draw the wife of Yoshitomo from her hiding place. He gave orders that Sekiya, the mother of the fair Takiwa, should be seized and brought before him. He told her sternly that if she would reveal her daughter's hiding place, she should be well treated, but if she refused to do as she was told, she would be tortured and put to death. When the old lady declared that she did not know where Takiwa was, as in truth she did not, Kiyomori thrust her into prison and had her treated cruelly day after day. Now the reason why Kiyomori was so set on finding Takiwa and her sons was that while Yoshitomo's heirs lived, he and his family could know no safety, for the strongest moral law in every Japanese heart was the old command: a man may not live under the same heaven with the murderer of his father. And the Japanese warrior recked nothing of life, awe, or death, of home or love, in obeying this as he deemed supreme commandment. Women too burned with the same zeal in avenging the wrongs of their fathers and husbands. Takiwa Gozen, though hiding in the country, heard of what had befallen her mother, and great was her sorrow and distress. She sat down on the mats and moaned aloud. "It is wrong of me to let my poor innocent mother suffer to save myself and my children, but if I give myself up, Kiyomori will surely take my lords, sons, and kill them. What shall I do? Oh, what shall I do?" Poor Takiwa. Her heart was torn between her love for her mother and her love for her children. Her anxiety and distraction were pitiful to see. Finally, she decided that it was impossible for her to remain still and silent under the circumstances. She could not endure the thought that her mother was suffering persecution, while she had the power of preventing it. So holding the infant Ushiwaka in her bosom under her kimono, she took his 2 elder brothers, one 7 and the other 5 years of age, by the hand and started for the capital. There were no trains in those days, and all traveling by ordinary people had to be done on foot. Daimyos and great and important personages were carried in palanquins, and they only could travel in comfort and in state. Takiwa could not hope to meet with kindness or hospitality on the way, for she was a Minamoto, and the Terra being all powerful, it was death to anyone to harbor a Minamoto fugitive. So the obstacles that beset Takuwa were great, but she was a samurai woman, and she quailed not at duty, however hard or stern that duty was. The greater the difficulties, the higher her courage rose to meet them. At last she set out on her momentous and celebrated journey. It was winter time, and snow lay on the ground, and the wind blew piercingly cold, and the roads were bad. What Takuwa, a delicately nurtured woman, suffered from cold and fatigue, from loneliness and fear, from anxiety for her little children, from dread lest she should reach the capital too late to save her old mother, who might die under the cruel treatment into which she was being subjected, or be put to death by Kiyomori in his wrath, or finally lest she herself should be seized by the Terra, and her filial plan be frustrated before she could reach the capital. All this must have been greater than any words can tell. Sometimes poor distressed Takuwa sat down by the wayside to hush the wailing babe she carried in her bosom, or to rest the two little boys, tired and faint and famished, clung to her robes, crying for their usual rice. On and on she went, soothing and consoling them as best she could, till at last she reached Kyoto, weary, footsore, and almost heartbroken. But though she was well nigh overcome with physical exhaustion, yet her purpose never flagged. She went at once to the enemy's camp and asked to be admitted to the presence of General Kiyomori. And she was shown into the dread man's presence. She prostrated herself at his feet and said that she had come to give herself up and to release her mother. I am Takuwa, the widow of Yoshitomo. I have come with my 3 children to beseech you to spare my mother's life and to set her free. My poor old mother has done nothing wrong. I am guilty of hiding myself and the little ones, yet I pray humbly for your august forgiveness. She pleaded in such an agonizing way that Kiyomori, the Terra chieftain, was struck with admiration for her filial piety, a virtue more highly esteemed than any other in Japan. He felt sincerely sorry for Takuwa in her woe, and her beauty and her tears melted his hard heart, and he promised her that if she would become his wife, he would spare not only her mother's life, but her 3 children. Also, for the sake of saving her children's lives, the sad-hearted woman consented to Kiyomori's proposal. It must have been terrible to her to wed with her lord's enemy, the very man who had caused his death. But the thought that by so doing, she saved the lives of his sons, who would one day surely arise to avenge their father's cruel death, must have been her consolation and her recompense for the sacrifice. Kiyomori showed himself kinder to Takuwa than he had ever shown himself to anyone, for he allowed her to keep the babe Ushiwaka by her side. The 2 elder boys he sent to a temple to be trained as acolytes under the tutelage of priests. By placing them out of the world in the seclusion of priesthood, Kiyomori felt that he would have little to fear from them when they attained manhood. How terribly and bitterly he was mistaken we learn from history, for 2 of Yoshitomo's sons, banished though they had been for years and years, arose like a rushy mighty whirlwind from the obscurity of the monastery to avenge their father, and they wiped the Terra from off the face of the earth. Time passed by, and when the little babe Ushiwaka at last reached the age of 7, Kiyomori likewise took him from his mother and sent him to the priests. The sorrow of Takuwa, bereft of the last child of her beloved Lord Yoshitomo, can better be imagined than described. But in her golden captivity, even Kiyomori had not been able to deprive her of 1 iota of the incomparable power of motherhood, that of influencing the life of her child to the end of his days. As the little fellow had lain in her arms night and day, as she crooned him to sleep and taught him to walk, she forever whispered the name of Minamoto Yoshitomo in his ear. At last one day her patience was rewarded, and Ushiwaka lisped his father's name correctly. Then Takuwa clasped him proudly to her breast, and wept tears of thankfulness and joy and of sorrowing remembrance, for she could never even for a day banish Yoshitomo from her mind. As Ushiwaka grew older and could understand better what she said, Takuwa would daily whisper, "Remember thy father, Minamoto Yoshitomo, grow strong and avenge his death, for he died at the hands of the Terra. And day by day, she told him stories of his great and good father, of his martial prowess in battle, and of his great strength and wonderful wheel. Ding of the sword, and she bade her little son remember and be like his father. And the mother's words and tears, sown in long years of patience and bitter endurance, bore fruit beyond all she had ever hoped or dreamed. So Ushiwaka was taken from his mother at the age of 7, and was sent to the Takobo monastery at Kurameyama to be trained as a monk. Even at that early age, he showed great intelligence, read the sacred books with avidity, and surprised the priest. By his diligence and quickness of memory, he was naturally a very high-spirited youth, and could brook no control and hated to yield to others in anything whatsoever. As the years passed by and he grew older, he came to hear from his teachers and school friends of how his father Yoshitomo and his clan, the Minamoto, had been overthrown by the Terra. And this filled him with such intense sorrow and bitterness that sleeping or waking he could never banish the subject from his mind. As he listened daily to these things, the words of his mother, which she had whispered in his ear as a child, now came throbbing back to his mind, and he understood their full meaning for the first time. In the lonely nights he felt again her hot tears falling on his face, and heard her repeat as clearly as a bell in the silence of the darkness. Remember thy father, Minamoto Yoshitomo, avenge his death, for he died at the hands of the Terra. At last one night the lad dreamed that his mother, beautiful and sad as he remembered her in the days of his childhood, came to his bedside and said to him, while the tears streamed down her face, "Avenge thy father, Yoshitomo, unless thou remember my last words, I not rest in my grave. I am dying, Ushiwaka, remember." And Ushiwaka awoke as he cried aloud in his agony, "I will, honorable mother, I will." From that night his heart burned within him, and the fire and love of clan race stirred his soul. Continual brooding over the wrongs of his clan generated in his heart a fierce desire for revenge, and he finally resolved to abandon the priesthood, become a great general like his father, and punish the Terra. And as his ambition was fired and exalted, and his mind thrilled back to the days when his poor unhappy mother Takiwa prayed and wept over him, daily whispering in his ear the name of his father, his will grew to purpose strong. Takiwa had not suffered in vain. From this time on, Ushiwaka bided his time every night till all in the temple were fast asleep. When he heard the priests snoring and knew himself safe from observation, he would steal out from the temple, and making his way down the hillside into the valley, he would draw his wooden sword and practice fencing by himself, and striking the trees and the stones imagine that they were his Terra foes. As he worked in this way night after night, he felt his muscles grow strong, and this practice taught him how to wield his sword with skill. One night, as usual, Ushiwaka had gone out to the valley and was diligently brandishing about his wooden sword. His mind fully bent upon his self-taught lesson, he was marching up and down, chanting snatches of war songs and striking the trees and the rocks, when suddenly a great cloud spread over the heavens. The rain fell, the thunder roared, and the lightning flashed, and a great noise went through the valley, as if all the trees were being torn up by the roots, and their trunks were splitting. While Ushiwaka wondered what this could mean, a great giant over 10 feet in height stood before him. He had large, round, glaring eyes that glinted like metal mirrors. His nose was bright red, and it must have been about a foot long. His hands were like the claws of a bird, and to each there were only 2 fingers. The feathers of long wings at each side peeped from under the creature's robes, and he looked like a gigantic goblin. Fearful indeed was this apparition. But Ushiwaka was a brave and spirited youth, and the son of a soldier, and he was not to be daunted by anything. Without moving a muscle of his face, he gripped his sword, or tightly, and simply asked, "Who are you, sir?" The goblin laughed aloud and said, "I am the king of the Tengu, the elves of the mountains, and I have made this valley my home for many a long year. I have admired your perseverance in coming to This place night after night for the purpose of practicing fencing all by yourself, and I have come to meet you, with the intention of teaching you all I know of the art of the sword." Ushiwaka was delighted when he heard this, for the Tengu have supernatural powers, and fortunate indeed are those whom they favor. He thanked the giant elf and expressed his readiness to begin at once. He then whirled up his sword and began to attack the Tengu, but the elf shifted his position with the quickness of lightning, and taking from his belt a fan made of 7 feathers, parried the showering blows right and left so cleverly that the young knight's interest became thoroughly aroused. Every night he came out for the lesson. He never missed once, summer or winter, and in this way he learned all the secrets of the art which the Tengu could teach him. The Tengu was a great master and Ushiwaka an apt pupil. He became so proficient in fencing that he could overcome 10 or 20 all Tengu in the twinkling of an eye, and he acquired extraordinary skill and dexterity in the use of the sword. And the Tengu also imparted to him the wonderful adroitness and agility which made him so famous in afterlife. Now Ushiwaka was about 15 years old, a comely youth and tall for his age. At this time there lived on Mount Hiei, just outside the capital, a wild bonze named Musashi Benkei, who was such a lawless and turbulent fellow. And he had become notorious for his deeds of violence. The city rang with the stories of his misdeeds, and so well known had he become that people could not hear his name without fear and trembling. Benkei suddenly made up his mind that it would be good sport to steal 1,000 swords from various knights. No sooner did the wild idea enter his head than he began to put it into practice. Every night he sauntered forth to the Gojo Bridge of Kyoto, and when a knight or any man carrying a sword passed by, Benkei would snatch the weapon from his girdle. If the owners yielded up their blades quietly, Benkei allowed them to pass unhurt, but if not, he would strike them dead with a single blow of the huge halberd he carried. So great was Benkei's strength that he always overcame his victim. Resistance was useless, and night by night 1 and sometimes 2 men met death at his hands on the Gojo Bridge. In this way Benkei gained such a terrible reputation that everybody far and near feared to meet him, and after dark no one dared to pass near the bridge he was known to haunt. So fearful were the tales told of the dreaded robber of swords. At last, this story reached the ears of Ushiwaka, and he said to himself, "What an interesting man this must be. If it is true that he is a bonze, he must be a strange one indeed, but as he only robs people of their swords, he cannot be a common highwayman. I could make such a strong man a retainer of mine, he would be of great assistance to me when I punish my enemies, the Terra clan. Good. Tonight I will go to the Gojo Bridge and try the mettle of this Benkei." Ushiwaka, being a youth of great courage, had no sooner made up his mind to meet Benkei than he proceeded to put his plan into execution. He started out that same evening. It was a beautiful moonlight night, and taking with him his favorite flute, he strolled forth through the streets of the sleeping city till he came to the Gojo Bridge. Then, from the opposite direction, came a tall figure which appeared to touch the clouds, so gigantic was its stature. The stranger was clad in a suit, coal-black armor, and carried an immense halberd. "This must be the sword robber. He is indeed strong," said Ushiwaka to himself, but he was not in the least daunted and went on playing his flute quite calmly. Presently the armed Jai and halted and gazed at Ushiwaka, but evidently thought him a mere youth, and decided to let him go unmolested, for he was about to pass him by without lifting a hand. This indifference on the part of Benkei not only disappointed, but angered Ushiwaka. Having waited in vain for the stranger to offer violence, our hero approached Benkei, and, with the intention of picking a quarrel, suddenly kicked the latter's halberd out of his hand. Benkei, who had first thought to spare Ushiwaka on account of his youth, became very angry when he found himself insulted by a lad to whom he had been intentionally kind. In a fury he exclaimed, "Miserable stripling!" and raising his halberd struck sideways at Ushiwaka, thinking to slice him in 2 at the waist and to see his body fall asunder. But the young knight nimbly avoided the blow which would have killed him, and springing back a few paces, he flung his fan at Benkei's head and uttered a loud cry of Defiance. The fan struck Benkei on the forehead right between the eyes, making him mad with pain. In a transport of rage, Benkei aimed a fearful blow at Ushiwaka, as if he were splitting a log of wood with an axe. This time, Ushiwaka sprang up to the parapet of the bridge, clapped his hands, and laughed in derision, saying, "Here I am, don't you see? Here I am." And Benkei was again thwarted thus. Benkei, who had never known his strokes miss before, had now failed twice in cat. Shing this nimble opponent. Frantic with chagrin and baffled rage, he now rushed furiously to the attack, whirling his great halberd round in all directions till it looked like a water wheel in motion, striking wildly and blindly at Ushiwaka. But the young knight had been taught tricks innumerable by the giant Tengu of Kurameyama, and he had profited so well by his lessons that the King Tengu had at last said that even he could teach him nothing more, and now, as it may well be imagined, he was too quick for the heavy Benkei. When Benkei struck in front, Ushiwaka was behind, and when Benkei aimed a blow behind, Ushiwaka darted in front. Nimble as a monkey and swift as a swallow, Ushiwaka avoided all the blows aimed at him, and finding himself outmatched, even the redoubtable Benkei grew tired. Ushiwaka saw that Benkei was played out. He kept up the game a little longer and then changed his tactics. Seizing his opportunity, he knocked Benkei's halberd out of his hand. When the giant stooped to pick his weapon up, Ushiwaka ran behind him and with a quick movement tripped him up. There lay the big man on all fours, while Ushiwaka nimbly strode across his back and, pressing him down, asked him how he liked this kind of play. All this time, Benkei had wondered at the courage of the youth in attacking and challenging a man so much larger than himself. But now he was filled with amazement. Ushiwaka's wonderful strength and adroitness. "I am indeed astonished at what you have done," said Benkei. "Who in the world can you be? I have fought with many men on this bridge, but you are the first of my antagonists who has displayed such strength. Are you a god or a Tengu? You certainly cannot be an ordinary human being." Ushiwaka laughed and said, "Are you afraid for the first time then?" "I am," answered Benkei. "Will you from henceforth be my retainer?" demanded Ushiwaka. "I will in very truth be your retainer, but may I know who you are?" asked Benkei meekly. Ushiwaka now felt sure that Benkei was in earnest. He therefore allowed him to get up from the ground and then said, "I have nothing to hide from you. I am the youngest son of Minamoto Yoshitomo, and my name is Ushiwaka." Benkei started with surprise when he heard these words and said, "What is this I hear? Are you in truth a son of the Lord Yoshitomo of the Minamoto clan? That is the reason I felt from the first moment of our encounter that your deeds were not those of a common person. No wonder that I thought this. I'm only too happy to become the retainer of such a distinguished and spirited young knight. I will follow you as my lord and master from this very moment, if you will allow me. I can wish for no greater honor." So there and then, on the Gojo Bridge in the silver moonlight, the bonds Benkei vowed to be the true and faithful vassal of the young knight Ushiwaka and to serve him loyally till death, and thus was the compact between lord and vassal made. From that time on, Benkei gave up his wild and lawless ways and devoted his life to the service of Ushiwaka, who was highly pleased at having won such a strong liegeman to his side. Although Ushiwaka had now secured Benkei, it was impossible for only two men, however strong, to think of fighting the Terra clan. So they both decided that the cherished plan must wait till the Minamoto were stronger. While thus waiting, they heard a report to the effect that a descendant of Tawara Toda Hidesato, named Hachiro, was now a famous general in Kaiwai of the Ashu province, and that he was so powerful that no one dared oppose him. Hearing this, Ushiwaka thought that it would be a good plan to pay the general a visit and try to interest him, if possible, in the fortunes of the house of Minamoto. He consulted with Benkei, who encouraged the young knight in his scheme of enlisting the general Hachiro as a partisan, and the two therefore left Kyoto secretly and journeyed as quickly as possible to Oshu on this errand. On the way there, Ushiwaka and Benkei. It came to the temple of Atsuta, and as they considered it important that the young knight should look older now, Ushiwaka performed the ceremony of Gembuku at the shrine. This was a rite performed in olden times when youths reached the age of manhood. They then had to shave off the front part of their hair and to change their names as a sign that they had left childhood behind. Ushiwaka now took the name of Yoshitsune. As he was the 8th son, it would have been more correct for him to have assumed the name of Hachiro, but as his uncle Tametomo the archer, of whom you have already read, was named Hachiro, he purposely did not take this name. From this time forth our hero is known as Yoshitsune, and this name he is glorified forever by his wonderful bravery and many heroic exploits. In Japanese history, he is the knight without fear and without reproach, the darling of the people. To them, almost an incarnation of Hachiman, the poppy, a god of war. And as for Benkei, never can you find in all history a vassal who was more true or loyal to his master than Benkei. He was Yoshitsune's right hand in everything, and his strength and wisdom carried them successfully through many a dire emergency. From Kyoto to Oshu is a long journey of about 300 miles, but at length Yoshitsune, as we must now call him, and Benkei reached their destination and craved the General Hachira's assistance. They found that Hachiro was a warm adherent of the Minamoto cause, and under the late Lord Yoshitomo, he and his family had enjoyed great favor. When the general learned, therefore, that Yoshitsune was the son of the illustrious Minamoto chief, his joy knew no bounds, and he made Yoshitsune and Benkei heartily welcome and treated them both as guests of honor and importance. Just at this time, Yoshitsune's eldest brother, Yoritomo, who had been banished to an island in Idzu, collected a great army and raised his standard against the Terra. When the news about Yoritomo reached Yoshitsune, he rejoiced, for he felt that the hour had at last come when the Minamoto would be revenged on the Terra for all the wrongs they had suffered at the hands of the latter. With the help of Hachiro and the faithful Benkei, he collected a small army of warriors, and at once marched over to his brother's camp in Idzu. He sent a messenger ahead to inform Yoritomo that his youngest brother, now named Yoshitsune, was coming to aid him in his fight against the Terra. Yoritomo was exceedingly glad at this unexpected good news, for all that helped to swell his forces now brought nearer the day when he would be able to strike his long-planned blow at the power of the hated Terra. As soon as Yoshitsune reached Idzu, Yoritomo arranged for an immediate meeting. Although the two men were brothers, it must be remembered that their father had been killed, and the family utterly scattered when they were mere children, Yoshitsune being at that time but an infant in his mother's arms. As this was therefore the first time they had met, Yoritomo knew nothing of his young brother's character. One of Yoshitsune's elder brothers had come with him, and Yoritomo, being a shrewd general, wished to test them both to see of what metal they were made. He ordered his retainers to bring a brass basin full of boiling water. When it was brought, Yoritomo ordered Noriyori, the elder of the two, to carry it to him first. Now brass being a good conductor of heat, the basin was very hot, and Noriyori stupidly let it fall. Yoritomo ordered it to. He filled again and bade Yoshitsune bring it to him. Without moving a muscle of his handsome face, Yoshitsune took hold of the almost unbearably hot vessel and carried it with due ceremony slowly across the room. This exhibition of nerve and endurance filled Yoritomo with admiration, and he was favorably struck with Yoshitsune's character. As for Noriyori, who had been unable to hold a hot basin for a few moments, he had no use for him at all, except as a common soldier. Yoritomo begged Yoshitsune to become his right-hand man and zealously to espouse his cause. Yoshitsune declared that this had been his lifelong ambition ever since he could remember, as they both were sons of the same father. So was their cause, and destiny won. Yoritomo made Yoshitsune a general of part of his army, and ordered him in the name of his father Yoshitomo to chastise the Terra. Delighted beyond all words at the wonderfully auspicious events were taking, Yoshitsune hastened his preparations for the march. The longed-for hour had come to which through his whole childhood and youth he had looked forward, and for which his whole being had thirsted for many years, he could now fulfill the last words of his unhappy mother and punish the Terra for all the evil they had wrought against the Minamoto. All the wild restlessness of his youth, which had driven him forth to wield his wooden sword against the rocks in the Ki Uramayama Valley and to try his strength against Benkei on the Gojo Bridge, now found vent in action most dear to a born warrior's heart. With several thousands of troops under him, Yoshitsune marched up to Kyoto and waged war against the Terra and defeated them in a series of brilliant engagements. The stricken Terra multitudes fled before the Avenger like autumn leaves before the blast, and Yoshitsune pursued them to the sea. At Dan no Yura, the Terra made the last stand, but all in vain. Their lion leader, Kiyomori, was dead, and there was no great chieftain to rally them in the disordered retreat that now ensued. Yoshitsune came sweeping down upon them, and they and their fleet and their infant emperor likewise, with their women and children, sank beneath the waves. Only a scattered few lived to tell the tale of the terrible destruction that overtook them on the sea. Thus did Yoshitsune become a great warrior and general. Thus did he fulfill the ambitions of his youth and avenge his father Yoshitomo's death. He was without a rival in the whole country for his marvelous bravery and successive victories. He was adored by the people as their most popular hero and darling, and throughout the length and breadth of the land his praise was sung by everyone. Even to this day, there is no one in Japan who has not heard the name of Yoshitsune. The next story, the story of Benkei, will tell you more of Yoshitsune, for the two lives are linked together in the fame and glory of noble deeds done, of dangers past, of troubles and reverses borne, and of honors earned, and joy and victory shared together to be told and remembered forever. The story of Benkei, sequel to the story of Yoshitsune. Those who have read the story of the great warrior Yoshitsune will certainly remember that his retainer Benkei was a gigantic bonze as remarkable for his physical strength as he was for his original character. In the story of Yoshitsune, very little was said about Benkei. You may therefore like to hear something more about the famous man who is so favorite a hero with Japanese children, and so greatly respected in Japan for his faithfulness to his master. Benkei was the son of a Buddhist priest named Bensho, high steward of the temple of Gonjin at Kumano, a famous shrine from ancient times, and his mother was the daughter of a high court official of the second rank. Benkei was no ordinary mortal. Most children come into the world within 10 months, but Benkei kept his mother waiting 1 year and 6 months for him. And when he was born, he already had teeth and a luxuriant growth of hair, and was so strong and big that he could walk from the first as well as most children of 2 or 3 years of age. Seeing how extraordinarily big and strong he was, the family were lost in amazement. But their wonder quickly changed to dismay, for the mother died soon after giving birth to her son. The father, Bensho, was very angry at this, and took an aversion to the child who had brought, he said, so great a misfortune upon him. He even wished to abandon the boy altogether, believing that, as Benkei's birth had cost his mother's life, he would in after years only prove a curse to the family. Now the boy's aunt, who was married to a man named Yamanoi, hearing this, pitied her little nephew Benkei, and going to her brother said, "If you are going to treat the child so cruelly as to cast him away, please give him to me. I have no children and will bring him up as my own child. He is not responsible for his mother's death. It is fate and there is no help for it." Bensho consented to her taking the child, saying that he did not care what happened to him so long as he was kept out of his sight, for he could no longer bear to see him. So, Benkei was adopted by his aunt, who took him away to the capital of Kyoto. The child rewarded her care and grew to be a fine boy beyond all expectation. He was exceedingly strong and healthy. At 5 or 6 years of age, he was equal in size and strength to boys of 10 or 12, and gave promise of unusual intelligence and cleverness. Unfortunately, his face was as fierce as that of a demon, and he looked so truly savage and ugly that he gradually earned for himself the nickname of Oniwaka, or Demon Youth. In a few years, his uncle thought that it was time to send the boy to school, and he accordingly sent Benkei to the monastery of Izen and placed him under the tutorship of the famous priest Kwankei. In Japan, as in England in those times, all learning was in the hands of the priests, and the temples were the only schools. When Benkei arrived at Kwankei's temple, he was taught the reading and writing of Chinese characters. And he was at first docile and diligent, and obedient to all set over him. He made rapid progress, and not only satisfied but pleased his teacher, who commended his industry, but after a time he chafed at the restraint of his new surroundings and began to give trouble. Not content with being unruly himself, he would lead the other novices away from their studies into the mountains and play all kinds of rough games with them, and, of course, being by nature much stronger and bigger than any of them, none of his companions could stand against him. It therefore happened that in every contest he invariably gained the victory, and this elated him so much that he thought of nothing but his sports and his triumphs, and, neglecting his lessons entirely, practiced athletic games day after day, quite forgetting everything else. Oniwaka's teacher, Kwankei, hearing about the youth's wild doings and considering them as unseemly, sent for him and told him that such behavior not only grieved his guardians but brought disgrace upon the holy temple. But his rebuke fell upon deaf ears and did no good at all. While he was being scolded, Benkei listened respectfully enough, but as soon as the reverend teacher turned his back, he would forthwith be as wild, if not wilder, than ever. His conduct grew worse and worse, till at last, losing all patience, the master priest forbade him to go out of the house, and then enforced his order by shutting him up in a monastery. This punishment Oniwaka deeply resented, and one night, eluding the vigilance of his jailers, he stole out quietly, and picking up a great log of wood began to destroy everything he could. First he smashed the gateway, then the fences all round the temple, then he broke the shutters and the sliding screens inside. Indeed, everything he could reach he wrecked. The bonzes, roused from their slumbers by the unexpected noise, which sounded as if a troop of robbers were at work, were all so frightened that they could do nothing to stop the whirlwind of destruction. When Oniwaka had done all the mischief he felt that, after this last mad prank, the temple of Izen was no place for him, so he fled from the spot forever. He was now just 17 years of age, and he called himself Musashi Bo Benkei. Oniwaka showed a sense of humor when he called himself Musashi Bo Benkei. In olden times there lived in Izen a man named Musashi, who was turbulent and wild in his youth, and yet became a famous bonze and lived until the ripe age of 61. Oniwaka, having heard about the famous man, made up his mind to be like him, and therefore called himself Musashi Bo, or Musashi the Bonze. The first syllable Ben of Benkei was taken from the first character of his father's name, Bensho, and the second, K, was the last syllable of his teacher's name, Kwankei. The name Benkei was therefore a combination of the names of his father and teacher. Ashamed to return home to his uncle and aunt after his behavior at the monastery, Benkei made up his mind to travel. This he did much after the fashion of German apprentices at about the same period in Europe. Leaving Kyoto, he came to Osaka. From Osaka he went to the province of Owa in the island of Shikoku. He then traveled all through that island, and thence wandered back to the mainland, where in the province of Harima he came at last to a monastery called Shosa. This monastery was as large as that of Izen, and Benkei thought that he would like to stay there for time as a student. With the consent of the abbot, Benkei was enrolled as an acolyte of this temple. Among the numerous novices in the temple, there was one named Kian, who was nearly as fond of mischief as Benkei himself, and he was known in the neighborhood for a troublesome fellow, no one young or old being safe from his foolish pranks. One day soon after Benkei's arrival, Kian found the newcomer taking a nap, so for fun he wrote on Benkei's cheek the Chinese character to forgetta or clog. When Benkei woke up and went into the courtyard, he noticed that everybody he came near seemed to be laughing at him, though nobody would say why. Thinking that there must be something strange in his appearance, he glanced into a bowl of water and at once discovered the cause of the merriment. Angry at the trick played on him, he seized a thick stick and rushing into the midst of his fellow novices shouted, "You rogues, I suppose you thought that you were doing something clever when you scribbled on my face. Now just come here one by one and kneel down and beg my pardon. If you do not, you will soon be sorry for yourselves." Benkei looked so angry and spoke so fiercely that most of the acolytes were frightened. 4 or 5 of the boldest, however, answered him back, saying, "What do you mean, you lazy fellow, by complaining about a trick played upon you while you were asleep in the middle of the day? If we hear any more of your grumbling, we will throw you out of the monastery." In this way they tried to frighten Benkei, but he did not budge an inch. His only reply was to lift his stick and knock down the 4 or 5 who had spoken. Seeing this, Ian, the author of all this trouble, rushed up, saying, "You are a coward to attack fellows half your size. Suppose for a change you fight with me." Then looking round for a weapon, and seeing a large log of wood on a fire close by, he picked it up and faced the enraged Benkei, adding, "It was I who scribbled on your face. If you are angry, come on and let us fight it out." The two closed at once and fought for some time. Then Benkei grew impatient and seizing Kian by his collar and belt lifted him off his feet. The other novices, seeing this, cried out in alarm, "Kian has been lifted off his feet. He can't fight now. He is helpless." Then they shouted to Kian to apologize and save himself. Pardon, Benkei, mercy," screamed the youth, now bitterly repenting his folly. Benkei, however, did not hear Kian's cry for mercy, for he was like a madman now. He hardly knew what he did or said, for his blood was fired by the taunts of the young men and by the fight. "You shall die," screamed Benkei. "Mannerless coward that you are, you shall die, I say, and your carcass shall be eaten by crows." With these words he shook Kian as mercilessly as a dog does a rat, and then flung him upon the tiled roof of the chapel, a height of some 14 or 15 feet. Kian fell on the roof, rolled down the tiles, at last striking a rock in the garden, was killed on the spot, when the foolish and unfortunate lad was flung up on the roof by Benkei. He still held the smoking brand which he had all to no purpose used against his antagonist, and this, falling on the building, flared up and set fire to the temple. Just then a breeze sprang up and fanned the flames into a fierce blaze. Sparks from the roof dropped upon the curving tiers of the 5-storied pagoda, and the main gateway, and the school and the houses of the bonzes, till the whole of the monastery was in a blaze. In the conflagration, all the inmates were lost in consternation, shouting, "Fire! Fire!" Some of them ran to draw water from the well, while others threw sand on the flames, and in the excitement and general confusion which followed, Benkei, a cause of the calamity, was forgotten. In the midst of the tremendous tumult and disturbance, Benkei laughed quietly to himself. "Ha, ha," he laughed. "Look at the fire and the stir I have made. I have never seen the lazy bonzes know what it is to hurry before. It will do them good for once in a way." Then he slipped away from the temple and made his way back to Kyoto. Benkei, wild and unruly as he was, cannot be judged by the standard of conduct of today. Those times were very different from these days of peace and order. Young men were encouraged to do rough, violent deeds to show their strength and courage, and if they killed their antagonists in the fight, so much the more did this redound to their credit. It was the custom for a young samurai, on obtaining a sword, to go out into the highways to try the metal of his blade. Woe to those who passed by, their blood must baptize the knight's sword. This training bred a martial spirit in the youth of Japan, and produced brave men of dauntless courage and resolution like Benkei, who became such a hero in afterlife. Benkei was, however, by this time tired of study and of living the dull life of a bonze, and he now made up his mind to rove about in search of adventures, determining that, should he find a stronger man than himself, he would become that man's vassal, turn from his wild ways and lead the life of a good samurai, faithful to his lord and a good patriot to his country. But first of all, he must find the man stronger than he to whom he would bow his proud, strong neck. He longed now to find a master worthy of respect, whom he could reverence as his superior. How was this to be? At last, an idea struck him. He had determined to be a soldier and enter the service of a samurai. He must therefore get a good sword. Violent and impetuous as ever, to this end he now vowed to take 1,000 swords from the city Zins of Kyoto. To carry out his wild scheme, he went nightly to the Gojo Bridge, and when men passed along bearing swords in their girdles, he would rush suddenly out, attack them furiously, and snatch away their swords. He never pursued, though, who ran away, for he deemed them cowards and would not waste his time or strength on such creatures. But those who opposed him, he would mow down with a single sweep of his great halberd. In this way, he had attacked 999 men and taken away 999 swords. Each time he had hoped to meet his match in the numerous contests, but not one among the whole number proved a serious foe. Accordingly, the swords Benkei had thus collected were all poor weapons, for weak men have like swords. They were blunt and badly tempered and of not the slightest use to him. He was heartily disappointed, and began to think that perhaps he had better abandon the enterprise as a vain one. In desperation, however, he determined to get one more sword and thus complete the total of 1,000 blades, the number he had first of all set his mind upon. In spite of discouragement, he told himself that it would be stupid to give up at this point. As soon as he had decided to do this, his spirits revived, and for some unaccountable reason he felt that this time he would be lucky, and able to secure once for all a good weapon. He waited impatiently for the evening, and as soon as the twilight fell, he made his preparations and went as usual to the Gojo Bridge. It happened to be the night of the 15th day of August, and the beautiful harvest moon sailed up into the serene heaven, above the hills and the tall dark velvety pines and cryptomerias, and the sleeping world was bathed in her soft silvery brilliance. For a long time Benkei stood leaning against the parapet of the bridge, entranced by the fair scene spread out before him in the moonlight, and apparently quite forgetful for the time being of his purpose. Suddenly, the stillness of the beautiful night was broken by the sound of a flute. Benkei started from his reverie. The music drew near, and nearer, and then he saw a slight figure approaching from the other end of the bridge. The newcomer wore a kind of white veil and high black lacquered clogs, and was playing on his flute as he strolled along. Benkei watched the approaching stranger and saw at once that this was no ordinary passerby. At first he thought that this must be a woman, for the moonlight revealed a slender grace in walking, and then on nearer view a face of extreme youth and aristocratic beauty. He could not find the heart to attack the mysterious and gentle unknown, and decided to let him or her pass unmolested. But while he was wondering who the person, so unlike all the others he had met on the bridge, could be the supposed lady, all of a sudden stepped up to Benkei and kicked the latter's halberd out of his hand. "What are you doing?" shouted Benkei, in a rage when he had recovered from his astonishment. And recovering his halberd, he pulled off what he supposed to be the lady's veil. To his surprise, he found that the adventurous stranger was a handsome youth who might easily be mistaken for a girl. And then Benkei's eyes fell upon a splendid gold-mounted sword which the lad carried in his girdle. He said to himself that he had not waited so long in vain, that he was verily in luck this night to have such a bird come into net. While these thoughts flashed through his mind, Benkei clutched at the sword, but the youth was far stronger than he looked, and the instant Benkei put forth his hand, the young fellow flung a heavy fan in his face, saying, "How brave you think yourself, don't you?" and darted out of his reach. This made Benkei more angry than ever, and with threatening exclamations he lifted his halberd to deal a smashing blow on the young knight. But the lad was far too quick for Benkei and sprang about with the nimbleness of a monkey, and no matter how Benkei aimed his blows, they never reached the mark. Never. had Benkei seen such agility and adroitness? Sometimes the youth appeared in front, and sometimes behind, now on one side and again on the other. And as often as Benkei turned, he would find that his opponent had shifted his position like Lai. Ning. At length, Benkei grew tired, and a sense of awe began to take hold of his mind, for he now felt that the youth must be a supernatural being, or a Tengu, and no common mortal, and this feeling grew upon him so strongly that he began to lose heart. He knew now that he was no longer invincible as he had hitherto been. Then the lad, who had hitherto acted on the defensive, began to push his advantage, and, attacking Benkei in good earnest, beat down a latter's guard and disarmed him. When the redoubtable Benkei, who had never yet been beaten by anyone in his whole life, found himself thus ignominiously defeated, he was astonished beyond words, and there and then, kneeling down on the bridge, bowed low before the young man and humbly said, "Will you condescend to tell me whose son you are and your name? Something tells me that you are no common man." The handsome youth laughed and replied, "I am the 8th and youngest son of Minamoto Yoshitomo, and my name is Minamoto Ushiwaka." And with these words he allowed Benkei to rise. "What do I hear?" exclaimed Benkei. "Are you indeed the young knight Minamoto Ushiwaka of whom I have heard so much? I felt from the first that you were a person of distinction. As for myself, I am simply Musashi-bo Benkei. For a long time I have been looking for a man stronger than myself to whom I could look up as my master. I have led a wild lie for a long time, but if you will take me into your service, I will be a good and faithful vassal." Ushiwaka, who had heard of Benkei's remarkable strength, and who had come out that night to the Gojo Bridge for the purpose of meeting the notorious man with the hope of winning him to his side, was delighted at the turn events had taken and promised to take Benkei into his service. And in this way, the brave youth and the giant priest became associated as lord and vassal. From this hour, Benkei was a completely changed character. He gave up his wild ways and became obedient to his young master, who was the only one he had found a match for his imposing strength and will. He served his new lord with the utmost devotion, and fought bravely in every battle which Yoshitsune, Ushiwaka's name when he came of age, waged against the Terra clan at the famous battles of Ikai no Tani and Dan no Yura, of which you will have read in the story of Yoshitsune. Yoshitsune won victory after victory, driving his Terra enemies to the sea, where they miserably perished at Dan no Yura, and it seemed to the wondering people that he must be the impersonation of Hachiman, the god of war. Oh, handsome and brave was he that they had never seen or heard of his like before, and throughout Japan everyone praised and loved him. Now Yoritomo, when he saw his brother's popularity, became jealous, and Kajiwara, one of his generals, who hated Yoshitsune, because the young knight had once openly reproved him for cowardice, seized the opportunity to poison Yoritomo's mind against his younger brother. He suggested that Yoshitsune's aim was to supplant Yoritomo in supreme authority. Sad to say, Yoritomo believed this wicked slander. Therefore, when Yoshitsune, covered with glory and honor, returned from the wars, bringing with him, as prisoners of war, Monomori, the Terra chieftain, and his son, Kiyomori, was now dead, he found that Yoritomo had erected a barrier near Kashigo, just outside Kamakura. Here he sent a guard to receive the prisoners, but on the ground that Yoshitsune was guilty of treachery. Yoritomo refused him admittance into Kamakura. In vain did Yoshitsune protest against the unjust accusation. In vain did he write a touching letter avowing his unaltered love and devotion to Yoritomo. In vain did he recount all the hardships endured on the campaigns which the young and chivalrous general had undertaken at the command of his brother. He was not believed, and ingratitude was the only reward he received for devotion to his brother's cause. At this crisis, Yoshitsune found himself banished and every part of Japan rendered unsafe for his residence, for Yoritomo ordered him to be arrested. When this time of trouble came, Benkei was indefatigable in his efforts to guard Yoshitsune's person from danger. He followed him in his flight and exile, and never left his master's side. Yoshitsune now returned to Kyoto for a time. Soon after he arrived, there Yoritomo sent a man named Tasabo to compass his death. This man, like Benkei, had formerly been a bonze, and he gave out that he had come to visit the temples of the capital. Tasabo knew very well what a shrewd and clever warrior Yoshitsune was, and he doubted his own ability to cope with the task he had undertaken. He therefore decided that he would wait until Yoshitsune was completely off his guard, and then make a sudden attack upon the house where he was staying. He told his followers of his plan and secretly prepared for the raid. Yoshitsune soon learned of Tasabo's coming, for the people of Kyoto and its neighborhood, where he had lived as a boy, were devoted to him. The young general, knowing that Tasabo was in Yoritomo's service, did him with suspicion. He told Benkei of his fears, and Benkei at once volunteered to go and summon Tasabo to the house and question him. Yoshitsune agreed to the plan, and Benkei immediately set off for Tasabo's house. "Now, Abo," said he, "my lord Yoshitsune desires to see you, so you are to come back with me at once." Benkei's manner was so fierce and determined that Tasabo felt alarmed, and he therefore pretended to be ill. But Benkei was not to be balked in that stupid way and shouting, "If you are not quick, I'll seize you and take you whether you will or not." He grabbed Tasabo by his girdle and lifted him up as if he had been a child, tucked him under one arm, and mounting his horse, carried him off. There were several of Tasabo's retainers present at the interview, but they were all trembling with fear and did not dare to put forth a hand to help their master. Benkei thus conducted Tasabo into the presence of Yoshitsune by force, and both master and vassal began to examine him strictly. But Tasabo was such an audacious rascal that, notwithstanding the fact that he had actually come from Yoritomo, hired as an assassin, he refused to confess anything. With great humility, he feigned surprise at being suspected of entertaining designs against Yoshitsune's life, saying that he was but a poor bonze in Yoritomo's service, and as Yoshitsune was his master's brother, Tasabo regarded him as his lord also. Nothing else but a religious fast and retreat had called him to Kyoto. Now Yoshitsune and Benkei had no actual proof of his guilt, so they allowed Tasabo to go free first, making him sign a document declaring that he was not a hired assassin. In truth, neither of them believed the crafty man, but thought him too despicable an enemy to fear, and made up their minds that, if he and his gang planned a night assault, the party could be easily repulsed and put to flight. Tasabo, on his part, congratulated himself on his cleverness, returned home, armed his men, and made an attack on Yoshitsune's residence. Yoshitsune that night, thinking that at any rate for some time he was quite safe from attack, made merry with all his men. Drinking amber-colored wine, they sat up late, and when at last the young general retired to rest, having drunk much, he slept a deep sleep. His beautiful young wife Shizuka, who accompanied him in all his wanderings, fearing she knew not what, that night alone kept watch beside her lord's couch. She was the first to hear the approach of Tasabo and his soldiers. Vainly she tried to rouse Yoshitsune, she called him, she shook him, but all in vain, he slept on. Shizuka was frantic. She heard the enemy at the gate trying to batter it down. Suddenly the thought struck her, as if by inspiration, that the most thrilling call to arms to a warrior must be the sound of his armor. She rushed to the box in the hall, and heavy as it was for her slender strength, she lifted out the armor. She dragged it quickly into the room. Then over Yoshitsune's head she waved it to and fro. Clang, clang, sounded the armor. Clang, clang. Up sprang the warrior, seized the suit of armor, and with Shizuka's help dressed himself for battle. All this took place without a single word. Benkei and the rest of his soldiers soon joined him, and the enemy were put to flight. Tasabo managed to escape and hide himself in the mountains of Kurama, near Kyoto, but he was caught and put to death at last. To have been able to thwart and punish the assassins from Kamakura was a source of great satisfaction to Yoshitsune and his men. But when the story reached Yoritomo, he was very wroth, and issued another decree entirely disowning Yoshitsune and declaring him an enemy to the state. Yoshitsune felt that Yoritomo was acting most unjustly towards him, for he knew himself to be entirely blameless of plotting against Yoritomo's supremacy. But as it was useless to contend against his elder brother, who as Agun was the military ruler of Japan, he decided to leave Kyoto and escape to some other place. He therefore planned to cross from the province of Setsu to Seikoku in a ship, but when they reached Dan-no-yura, where Yoshitsune finally conquered and all but terminated the Terra clan, the fine weather they had hitherto experienced suddenly changed. The sky became overcast with black clouds, rain began to fall in torrents, the wind began to blow and gradually the waves rose higher and higher, and shipwreck became imminent. As the darkness deepened about them, though they could see nothing, over the water there came weird sounds of the din of battle, the rushing of ships through the sea, the shouting and trampling of men, the whizzing of arrows in the air. All around them as the ship sped on, the tumult of the fight grew louder, till Yoshitsune felt that he was living again through that awful and never-to-be-forgotten battle. Then, from amid the rolling waves, which every moment threatened to engulf the boat, arose pale, ghastly forms whose wan faces were terrible to see. Clad in blood-stained, battle-torn armor and ravaged with gaping wounds, these warrior ghosts raised threatening hands, as if to stop the progress of the boat, while meanings of despair and hollow sobs and shrieks burst from the specter army. Among the foremost figures was one who brandished a huge halberd, and as he approached, he addressed Yoshitsune, saying, "Aha, revenge, revenge. Behold in me the ghost of Terano Tamamori, general of the Terra clan, ruthlessly destroyed by you. Long have I waited here for you, and now I will slay you all, for not until then will the slaughtered terror rest in their watery graves." Through the tossing, whirling waters, with the wind shrieking round them, and a weird blue phosphoric light making everything visible, the phantom host drew nearer and nearer to the boat. But Yoshitsune did not seem to be in the least alarmed. As dauntless as ever, he stood up in the prow and faced the ghosts of the men whom he had slain in that terrible battle, and flashing forth his keen blade, said, "So you are the spirits of the Terra clan, are you? And you have risen from the ocean bed to haunt us, and to impede our progress, and to inflict evil upon us. Have you forgotten how I drove you before me as dust before the wind when you were alive? It is a pity you have not profited. I passed experiences. I should have thought that you would have had no wish to see me again." With these words, he was about to brandish his sword and attack the specters, but Benkei, the wise and faithful Benkei, stepped up to his young master and it his hand, saying, "Not so, my lord. Swords are useless against ghosts. It is not wise to anger these poor earthbound phantoms. The best way of dealing with them is to pacify them, so that they may find peace and go to their own place." Yoshitsune yielded to Benkei and allowed himself to be put aside. Then Benkei, who you will remember had formerly been a Buddhist priest, drew out a small rosary which he always carried with him, and telling his beads and rubbing his hands together, palm to palm, began to recite prayers earnestly and reverently in a loud voice. The sacred words appointed by the Buddhist church fell like a benediction upon the angry spirits. The wailing and the howling and the tumult of the phantom conflict ceased, and the wraiths gradually vanished into the sea from whence they had arisen. The storm ceased, and the weather cleared and became as fine and peaceful as it was before, and the travelers soon reached the land in safety. Across the mountains Yoshitsune now fled, and after endless adventures and hairbreadth escapes, he determined to seek the help of his old friend and partisan, the General Hachiro in the province of Oshu. On the way thither they came to a guardhouse at Itaka, in Kaga province. This guardhouse was one of the principal frontier stations at which in those feudal times all travelers had to give an account of themselves. Yoritomo had by this time issued a proclamation ordering the arrest of Yoshitsune. So the young general and Benkei and the handful of faithful men still left to him disguised themselves as wandering priests, wearing loose caps on their heads, carrying wallets on their backs and grasping pilgrim staves in their hands. Yoshitsune himself was disguised as a goriki, or coolie, attendant on the priests. They traveled slowly until they came to the barrier, consulting together as to how they should pass it, for they heard that the Sen trees suspected everyone and were examining passers-by very strictly. Only the previous day 3 mendicants had been killed, owing to the suspicion of the guards having been excited, all Yoshitsune's followers, among whom were many brave. Oil, though headstrong young fellows, wanted to storm the guardhouse and cut their way through the soldiers. But Benkei was strongly opposed to this and said, "No, no, that will never do. A quarrel would cost some of our lives, and we have few. Enough as it is. Leave the matter to me to manage, and I'll get you through." No one ever gainsaid Benkei when he spoke with authority like that, for they all knew what a mountain of strength and resource he was in time of need. So Benkei, as ever, had his way. He disguised Yoshitsune in the dress of a servant, Goriki, and gave him a deep, broad-brimmed hat of bamboo to wear, and made him tuck up his robe into his belt. Then, advancing in front of the others, he leisurely approached the guardhouse, and with an air of the utmost unconcern and nonchalance said, "We are mendicant priests who are traveling throughout the various provinces for the purpose of soliciting subscriptions for the rebuilding of the shrine of the Great Bu at the Tadaiji Temple in Nara. We ask permission to pass the barrier." Now the captain of the guard was a very clever man and a strict observer of rules, and he would not let Benkei pass without questioning him thoroughly. "Well, as you are visiting the various provinces soliciting subscriptions for the purpose of rebuilding the shrine of the great Buddha, it is possible that I may allow you to pass, but you must show me positive proof of the truth of your story," said the captain of the guard. Benkei was staggered for a moment when he heard these words. What should he do? But he was a quick-witted man, and without betraying any sign of being taken by surprise, he answered with composure, "Very good then, I will read you my commission written by the high priest himself in the first pages of the subscription book." With these words, speculating upon the ignorance of the guard, with great dignity he drew out a scroll, and pressing it with reverence to his forehead, began to improvise and read out an imaginary letter from the high priest of the Tadaiji Temple for the rebuilding of a shrine for the Daibutsu at Nara. At the first mention of the name of the priest, so famous and so highly revered throughout the country, the captain of the guard, it is said, fell respectfully upon his knees and listened, face bent to the earth in humble awe, to the contents of the letter. So well did Benkei play his part that the sentry was convinced of the genuine character of the commission and said, "I am satisfied. There is no reason to detain you. You may pass." Benkei was overjoyed and thought that at length all difficulties had been overcome. At the head of the fugitive band with Yoshitsune, disguised as an attendant in the rear, he was moving forward to pass through the barrier when the captain suddenly darted forward and stopped Yoshitsune, saying in a loud voice, "Wait a moment, you coolie, wait a moment, we are discovered." The Benkei, and even he, dauntless and cool in the face of all danger hitherto, felt his heart beating violently in the intense excitement of this momentous crisis. But it was no time for hesitation, and recognizing that the whole situation hung upon that very moment, Benkei, with his usual pluck and daring, pulled himself together and coolly asked, "Have you anything to say to this coolie whom you have stopped?" "Of course I have, and that is why I have stopped him," replied the sentry. "And may I ask what your business with him is?" inquired Benkei. "This coolie," answered the captain, "is said by my soldiers to resemble Lord Yoshitsune, and I stopped him so that I might examine him." "What?" shouted Benkei, pretending to be overcome with laughter at the idea. "This coolie resembles Lord Yoshitsune. Ha, 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 oh, this is indeed too comical for anything. I wondered why you arrested him, but never thought of his being stopped. For such an absurd reason. But as a matter of fact, he has been mistaken for Lord Yoshitsune over and over again by several people, and you are by no means the only one who has had his suspicions aroused. You see, the fellow is handsome and has a very white skin like an aristocrat, and that's all the good there is about him, but on that account, I have had an immense amount of trouble with him." Then Benkei turned to Yoshitsune, saying, "Wretched creature, it is all Your fault that we come under suspicion all the time. You shuffle along in such a cowardly manner and put on such strange airs that people naturally suspect you. In future, be more careful and walk along like a man and not in such a mincing way, you fool." Thus Benkei feigned to lose his temper, and after scolding Yoshitsune roughly, finally lifted his staff and gave him several blows across the back, telling him to fall upon his knees and not presume to remain. Standing in the presence of the guard, the captain of the guard had been watching this scene for some moments, and when he saw Benkei start in and thrash Yoshitsune, his doubts were completely allayed, for he thought that if the apparent servant were Yoshitsune and the mendicant priest the latter's retainer, the vassal would never dare to assault his master in this fashion. Ah, it was my fault and carelessness. Evidently, it was an entire mistake on our part to think this coolie was Lord Yoshitsune, and it is not the poor fellow's fault, so pray do not beat him anymore. Continue your journey at once and take him with you. Benkei's trick thus succeeded completely. The captain re-entered the guardhouse and the young lord, and his vassals passed at last unhindered through the strictly guarded gate, saved as ever by the quick-wittedness of Benkei. Now some say that the captain of the guard was not deceived, that he knew that the disguised priests and attendant were Yoshitsune and his party, but his whole sympathy was with the hunted hero and his brave few, and he allowed them to pass. For a samurai must ever show mercy and sympathy, especially to his fellows and to those in distress. The strict examination he insisted upon was a farce he played to satisfy the authorities at Kamakura. Yoshitsune and his followers were filled with admiration at the wisdom of Benkei, and great were the praise and thanks they rendered him on this occasion. But Benkei, full of reverence and devotion to his master, never ceased to deplore the necessity which drove him to beat his own lord, and apologized with great humility. Whenever the story was told, he would shed tears of sorrow and declare, or that he would rather have been beaten to death himself than have been obliged by circumstances to strike Yoshitsune. Thus once by force of arms, he put to flight the would-be assassins of Yoshitsune at Kyoto. By reciting Buddhist prayers, he laid the ghosts of the Terra warriors in the sea at Dan-no-Yura, and by sheer wit and sagacity, he brought his party across the dangerous frontier. And at length, he managed to arrive safely with his beloved master at the Oshu residence of the famous General Hachiro. He now thought that all troubles were over. But unfortunately, this story soon reached Kamakura City, and Yoritomo, furious at Yoshitsune's daring, dispatched a large army to chastise him. At this time, Yoshitsune's camp was pitched beside the river Koromo, and the army from Kamakura, swarming up in countless thousands on the opposite bank, discharged volley after volley of arrows at the brave but ill-fated band. Yoshitsune's handful of men were entirely unable to face the overwhelming numbers, and fled in confusion, seeking shelter in the neighboring woods and valleys or hiding themselves in the mountains. But Benkei, despising flight, refused to budge and stood without moving while showers of arrows fell like rain around him. At length, the enemy saw that Benkei stood immovable with his 7 weapons on his back, grasping his great halberd in both hands. Wondering at the sight, they drew near for the purpose of solving the mystery. As they approached, the giant still remained standing. Not an eyelid flinched as his eyes, wide open, glared fiercely at the soldiers. No wonder that the giant did not stir, for arrows were sticking all over his body like quills on a porcupine, and it was evident that he had died standing with his face to the enemy. This story is known far and wide throughout Japan, and you can imagine what a brave, sturdy warrior he must have been to have. Eyed in this way, fighting to the last. Another story tells how the enemy came up to the wonderful figure of Benkei and found it to be but a straw dummy, and that by this device Benkei gained time for his beloved lord, with whom he escaped into the north, leaving their enemies far behind. Such is the story of Benkei, and the story does not end here, for tradition relates with much circumstance, as traditions always do, that Benkei's master became the conqueror of Northern Asia, known to after ages as the famous Genghis Khan, the Goblin of Oiyama. Long, long ago in old Japan, in the reign of the Emperor Akijo, the 66th emperor, there lived a very brave general called Minamoto no Reiko. Minamoto was the name of the powerful clan to which he belonged, and in England it would be called his surname, and Reiko, or Yorimitsu, was his own name. In those times, it was the custom for generals to keep as a bodyguard 4 knights renowned for their daring spirit, their great strength, and their skill in wielding the sword. These 4 braves were called Shitano, or 4 Kings of Heaven, and they participated in all the exploits and martial expeditions of their chief and vied with one another in excelling in bravery and dexterity. Minamoto no Reiko was no exception to the general rule of those ancient leaders of Japan, and he had under him Yuzui Sadamitsu, Sakata Kintoki, Yore, Ibsutake, and Watanabe Tsuna. The clan or surname comes first in Japan. Search the wide world from north to south and from east to west, and no braver warriors than the Shitano of Minamoto no Reiko could you find. Each one of the 4 was said to be a match single-handed for 1,000 men. They lived for adventure, and their delight was in war. Now it happened about this time that Kyoto, the capital, was ringing with the stories of the doings of a frightful demon that lived in the fastnesses of a high mountain called Mount Oi in the province of Tamba. This goblin or demon's name was Shutendoji. To look upon the creature was a horrible thing, and those who once caught sight of him never forgot the sight of their dying day. He sometimes took upon him the form of a human being, and leaving his den would steal into the capital and haunt the streets and carry off precious sons and beloved daughters of the Kyoto homes. Having seized these treasures and flowers of the people, he would drag them to his castle in the wilds of Mount Oi, and there he would make them work and wait upon him till he was ready to devour them. Then he would tear them limb from limb. For a long time the flower of the youth of the capital had been kidnapped in this way. Many homes had been made desolate. For a long, long time no one had the least idea of what happened to the sons and daughters thus stolen. But at the period when this story begins, the dread news of the cannibal Shutendoji and his mountain den began to be noised abroad. Now at the court, there was an official, Knight Kimitaka by name, who was thrice happy in the possession of a beautiful daughter. She was his only child, and upon her he and his wife doted. One day the darling of the family disappeared. No trace whatsoever of the beautiful girl could be found. The household was plunged into the deepest grief and misery. The mother at last determined to consult a Itzair, and, bidding an attendant follow her, she repaired to the house of a famous fortune-teller and diviner, who revealed to her that her daughter had been stolen away by the goblin of Mount Oi. The mother hastened home terror-stricken, and the father, when he was told the dire news, was dumb with grief. He gave up going on duty at the palace, for he was so broken-hearted that he could do nothing but weep night and day over the loss of his only daughter. To lose her was bad enough, but the thought of the horrible hands into which she had fallen was unendurable, and all who loved the poor child, even her own father, were powerless to save her. Oh, the bitter, bitter grief! At last the emperor heard of the sorrow that had overtaken Kimitaka, and his wrath was great to think that the hateful goblin had dared to enter the precincts of the sacred capital without permission, and had dared to steal away his subjects in this manner. And in his royal indignation, he sprang to his feet and threw down his tasseled fan and cried aloud, "Is there no one in my domains who will punish this goblin and destroy him utterly, and avenge the wrongs he has done my people and this city, and so set my heart at ease?" Then the emperor called his council together and put the matter before them and asked them what it were best to do, for the city must at all costs be rid of this terrible scourge. How dare he haunt my dominions and lay hands on I people in the very precincts of my palace, cried the distressed emperor. Then the ministers respectfully answered the emperor and said, "There are numbers of brave warriors in your majesty's realm, but there are none so able to do your bidding as Minamoto no Reiko. We would humbly advise our august emperor the son of heaven, to send for the knight and command him to slay the demon. Our poor counsel may not find favor in the son of heaven's sight, but at the present moment, we can think of nothing else to suggest. This advice pleased the Emperor Hachiro, and he answered that he had often heard of Reiko as a valiant knight and true, who knew not what fear was, and he had no doubt that, as his ministers said, he was just the man for the adventure. And so the emperor summoned Reiko to the palace at once. The warrior, on receiving the royal and unexpected summons, hastened to the palace, wondering what it could mean. When he was told what was wanted of him, he prostrated himself before the throne in humble acquiescence to the royal command. Indeed, Reiko was right glad at the thought of the adventure in store for him, for it had been quiet for some time in Kyoto, and he and his brave had chafed at the enforced idleness. The more he realized the awful difficulty of his task, the higher his courage and his spirits rose to face it, and the more he determined to do it or die in the attempt. He went home and thought out a plan of action. As the enemy was no human being, but a formidable goblin, he thought that the wisest course would be to resort to stratagem instead of an open encounter. So he decided to take with him a few of his most trusted men rather than a great number of soldiers. He then called together his 4 braves, Kintoki, Sadamitsu, Sutake, and Tsuna, and besides these another knight by name Hirai Yasumasa, nicknamed Hitori, which meant, as applied to him, the only warrior. Reiko told them of the expedition and explained that, as the demon was no common foe, he thought it wise that they should go to his mountain in disguise. In this way, they would the more likely and the more easily overcome the goblin. They all agreed to what their chief said and set about making their preparations with great joy. They polished up their armor and sharpened their long swords and tried on their helmets, rejoicing in the prospect of the action confronting them. Before starting on this dangerous enterprise, they thought it wise to seek the protection and blessing of the gods. So Reiko and Yasumasa went to pray for help at the temple of Hachiman, the god of war, at Mount Ato. While Tsuna and Kintoki went to the Sumiyoshi shrine of the goddess of mercy, and Sadamitsu and Sutake to the temple of Gonjin at Kumano. At each shrine, the 6 knights offered up the same prayer for divine help and strength, and, on bended knees, and with hands laid palm to palm, they besought the gods to grant them success in their expedition and a safe return to the capital. Then the brave band disguised themselves as mountain priests. They wore priests' caps and sacerdotal garments and stoles. They hid their armor and their helmets and their weapons in the knapsacks they carried on their backs. In their right hands they carried a pilgrim's staff, and in their left a rosary, and they wore rough straw sandals on their feet. No one meeting these dignified, solemn-looking priests would have thought that they were on the way to attack the goblin of Mount Oi, and no one would have dreamt that the leader of the band was the warrior Reiko, who for courage and strength had not his peer in the whole of the island empire. In this way, Reiko and his men traveled across the country till at last they reached the province of Tamba and came to the foot of the mountain of Oi. Now, as the goblin had chosen Mount Oi as his place of abode, you can imagine how difficult of access it was. Reiko and his men had often traveled in mountainous districts, but they had never experienced anything like the steepness of Mount Oi. It was indescribable. Great rocks obstructed the way, and the branches of the trees were so thickly interlaced overhead that the light of day could not penetrate through the foliage even at midday, and the shadows were so black that the warriors would have been glad of lanterns. Sometimes the path led them over precipices where they could hear the water rushing along the deep ravines beneath. So deep were these chasms that as Reiko and his men passed them, they were overcome with giddiness. For the first time they realized now the dangers and difficulties of the task they had undertaken, and they were somewhat disheartened. At times they rested themselves on the roots of trees to gain breath. Sometimes they stopped to quench their thirst at some trickling spring, catching the water up in their hands. They did not, however, allow themselves to be discouraged long, but pushed their way deeper and deeper into the mountain, encouraging each other with brave words of cheer when they felt their spirits flagging. But the thought sometimes crossed their minds, though they won and all kept it to themselves. What if Shutendoji, or some of his demons, should be lurking behind any of the rocks or cliffs? Suddenly, from behind a rock, 3 old men appeared. Now Reiko, who was as wise as he was brave, and who at that very moment had been thinking of what he should do were they to encounter the goblin unexpectedly, thought that sure enough here were some of the goblins who had heard of his approach. They had simply disguised themselves as these venerable old men so as to deceive him and his men. But he was not to be outwitted by any such prank. He made signs with his eyes to the men behind him to be on their guard, and they, in obedience to his gesture, put themselves in attitudes of defense. The 3 old men saw at once the mistake Reiko had made, for they smiled at him, and then drawing nearer, they bowed before him, and the foremost one said, "Do not be afraid of us, we are not the goblins of this mountain. I am from the province of Setsu. My friend is from Kiai, and the 3rd lives near the capital. We have all been bereft of our beloved wives and daughters by Shutendoji the goblin. Because of our great age, we can do nothing to help them, though our sorrow for their loss, instead of growing less, grows greater day by day. We have heard of your coming, and we have awaited you here, so that we might ask you to help us in our distress. It is a great favor we ask, but we entreat you, if you encounter Shutendoji, to show him no mercy, but to slay him and so avenge the wrongs of our wives and children, and many others who have been torn away from their homes in the our capital." Reiko listened attentively to all the old man said, and then answered, "Now that you have told me so much, I need not reserve the truth from you." And he went on to tell them of the order he had received from the emperor to destroy Shutendoji and his den, and the warrior did his best to comfort the old men, and to assure them that he would do all in his power to restore their kidnapped wives and daughters. Then the old men expressed great joy. Their faces beamed like the sun as they thanked Reiko warmly for his kind sympathy, and they presented him with a jar of sake, saying as they bowed low, "As a token of our gratitude, we wish to present you with this magic wine. It is called Shimbanki Dokushu. The name means a cordial for men but a poison to goblins. Therefore, if a demon drinks of this wine, all his strength will go from him, and he will be as one paralyzed. Before you attack Shutendoji, give him to drink of this wine, and for the rest you will find no difficulty." And with these words, the venerable spokesman handed the warrior a small white stone jar containing the wine. As soon as Reiko had taken the jar into his hands, a radiance like that of sunlight suddenly shone round the old men, and they vanished upwards from sight till their shining figures were lost in the clouds. The warriors were struck with astonishment. They gazed upwards as if stupefied, but Reiko was the first to recover from his surprise. He clapped his hands and laughed as he said, "Be not afraid at what you have seen. Be sure that the 3 who thus appeared to us are none other than the gods of the shrines we visited before starting on this perilous enterprise." The old man who said he was from Setsu must have been the deity of Sumiyoshi. The one from the province of Kiai was the divinity of Kumano, and the one from the capital, the god Hachiman of Mount Otoko. This is a most propitious sign. The 3 deities have taken us under their special protection. This sake is their gift, and it will surely be of magic power in helping us to overcome the demons. We must therefore render thanks to heaven for the protection vouchsafed to us. Then Reiko and his 5 knights knelt down on the mountain pass and bowed themselves to the ground and prayed for some minutes in silence, overcome with awe at the thought that the 3 gods whose aid they had invoked had visited them. Reiko sprang to his feet and lifted the jar of sake reverently above his head. Then he placed it with his armor and weapons in the box he carried on his back. Having done this, they all proceeded on their way, but oh, how safe and confident they now felt. Reiko, with his magic wine, felt more than a match for any demon now. There is a proverb which says, "A giant with an iron rod," which means strength added to strength, and this was fully illustrated in the case of Reiko. The The goblin Shutendoji was now to be pitied. It would surely go hard with him. As they sped on their way, they came to a mountain stream, and here they found a damsel washing a blood-stained garment. And as she washed and beat the garment against the current, they saw that she often had to stop and wipe the tears away with her sleeve, for she was weeping bitterly. Reiko's heart was stirred with pity at her distress, and he went up to her and said, "This is a goblin haunted mountain. How is it that I find a damsel such as you here?" The princess, for such she was, looked up in his face wonderingly and said, "It is indeed true that this is a goblin-haunted mountain, and hitherto inaccessible to mortals. How is it that you have managed to get here?" And she looked from Reiko to his men. Then Reiko said, "I will tell you the truth quite frankly. The emperor has commanded us to slay the demon. That is why we are here." Without waiting to hear an more, the princess ran up to Reiko in her joy and clung to him, crying out in broken sentences, "Are you indeed the great Reiko of whom I have so often heard? How thankful I am that you have come. I will be your guide to the goblin's den. Hasten, knight Reiko, and kill the demons. I already feel that I am saved." When they heard these words, the warriors knew that she was one of the goblin's victims. The princess turned and led the way up the hill. Presently they saw a large iron gate guarded by 2 demons. The demon on the right was red, and the demon on the left was black, and each was armed with a great iron stick or club. The princess whispered to Reiko, "Behold the home of the demon. Enter the gates, and you will find a beautiful palace, built of black iron from the foundations to the roof. It is therefore called the Palace of Black Iron or Kurigane. It is large, and the inside is as beautiful as a great daimyo's palace. Within the walls of the Palace of Black Iron, Shutendoji holds a feast night and day. He is waited upon by maidens such as I, whom he has carried off from the capital and from the provinces to be his slaves. The wine he drinks, poured out in Rimson lacquer cups, is the blood of human beings, and the food of those feasts is the flesh of his victims who are slain in turn. What numbers have I seen disappear, alas! All murdered to supply the awful food and wine of those cannibal Easts. How I have prayed to heaven to punish this monster. But when I saw the fate of my friends, how could I hope to live? I knew not when my turn would come. But since I have met you, I feel that we shall all be saved, and great is my joy and gratitude." By this time they had reached the gate, and the princess went forward and said to the red and black demon sentinels, "These poor travelers have lost their way on this mountain. I took compassion on them and brought them here, so that they may rest for a while before going on their journey. I hope you will be kind to them." When the princess first began to speak, the demons looked and saw Reiko and his fellow priests, little dreaming who these men were, and that admitting them, they were letting in the bravest knights in the whole of Japan, and still less suspecting their purpose, the demons laughed in their hearts. Good prey had indeed fallen into their hands. They would surely be allowed a share in the feast that these fresh victims would furnish. They grinned from ear to ear at the princess, and told her that she had done well, and bade her take the 6 travelers into the palace and inform Shutendoji of their arrival. Thus the 6 warriors entered into the very stronghold of the demons as if they were invited guests. Triumphant glee at the success of their plan made them exchange lightning glances with each other. They passed through the great iron gate, up to the porch, and then the princess led them through large spacious rooms and along great corridors till at last they reached the inner part of the palace. Here they were shown into a large hall. At the upper end in the seat of honor sat the demon king Shutendoji. Never had the knights in their wildest dreams dreamt of such a hideous monster. He was 10 feet in height, his skin was bright red, and his wild shock of hair was like a broom. He wore a crimson hakama, and he rested his huge arms on a stand. As the knights entered, he glared at them fiercely with eyes as big as a dish. The sight of this dread monster was enough to make anyone tremble with fear, and had Reiko and his knights been weak, they must have fainted away with horror. Reiko could hardly restrain himself from flying at the monster then and there. but he controlled himself and bowed humbly so as not to awaken the enemy's suspicion in any way. Shutendoji, glaring at him, said haughtily, "I do not know who you are in the least, or how you have found your way into this mountain, but make yourself at home." Then Reiko answered meekly, "We are only humble mountain priests from Mount Hachiro of Dua. We were on our way to the capital, having been on a pilgrimage to the shrine of Amine. In traveling across these mountains, we have lost our way. While wandering about and wondering which was the right path to take, we were met by one of the inmates of your palace and kindly brought here. Please pardon us for trespassing on your domains and for all the trouble we are giving you." "Don't mention it," said Shutendoji. "I am sorry to hear of your plight. Do not stand on ceremony while you are here, and let us feast together." Then turning to the attendant demons, he shouted orders for the dinner to be served, and clapped his red hands together. At this, the partitions between the rooms slid apart, and beautiful damsels magnificently robed came gliding in, bearing aloft in their hands large wine cups, jars of sake and dishes of fish of all kinds, which they placed before the ugly goblin and the guests. Reiko knew that all these lovely princesses had been snatched from the flower capital by Shutendoji, who, heedless of their tears and misery, kept them here to be his handmaidens. He said to himself fiercely that they should soon be free. Now that the wine cups were brought in, the warrior seized his opportunity. From his satchel he took out a jar containing the enchanted wine, Shimbankido Kushu, which he had received from the gods of the 3 shrines, and said to Shutendoji, "Here is some wine which we have brought from Mount Hachiro. It is a poor wine and unworthy of your acceptance, but we have always found it of great benefit in refreshing us when we were weary from fatigue and in cheering our drooping spirits. It will give us much pleasure if you will try a little of our humble wine, though it may not please your taste." Shutendoji seemed pleased at this courtesy. He handed out a huge cup to be filled, saying, "Give me some of your wine, I should like to try it." The goblin drained it at one swallow and smacked his lips over it. "You have never tasted such excellent wine," he said, and held out his cup to be filled again. You can imagine how delighted Reiko was, for he knew full well that the demon was given into his hand. But he dissembled cleverly and said as he filled the goblin's wine cup, "I am delighted that the honorable host should deign to like our poor country wine. While you drink, I and my companions will venture to amuse you by our dancing." Then Reiko made a sign to his men, and they began to chant an accompaniment while he himself danced. Shutendoji was highly amused as well as his attendants. They had never seen men dance before, and they thought that the strangers were very entertaining. The goblins now began to pass the magic wine round and to grow merry. Others meanwhile whispered among themselves, pitying the 6 travelers who, all unconscious of the horrible fate which was about to overtake them, were spending their last hours of liberty and probably of life in giving wine to their slayers, and in dancing and singing for their amusement already. However, the power of the enchanted wine had begun to work, and Shutendoji grew drowsy. The wine in the jar never seemed to grow less, however much was taken from it, and by this time all the demons had helped themselves liberally. At last they all fell into a deep sleep, and stretching themselves out on the floor and on one another, some in one corner and some in another, they were and snoring so loudly that the room shook, and were as insensible to all that was going on as logs of wood. "The time has come," said Reiko, springing to his feet and motioning to his men to get to work. One and all hastily opened their knapsacks. Taking out their helmets, their armor, and their long swords, they armed themselves. When they were all ready, they all knelt down, and, placing their hands palm to palm, they prayed fervently to their patron gods to help them now in their hour of greatest need and peril. As they prayed, a shining light filled the room, and in a radiant cloud the 3 deities appeared again. "Fear not, warrior Reiko," they said. "We have tied the hands and feet of the demon fast, so you have nothing to fear. While your knights cut off his limbs, do you cut off his head, then kill the rest of the Oni, and your work will be done." The three old men then disappeared as mysteriously as they had come. Reiko rejoiced at the vision and worshipped with his heart full of gratitude the vanishing deities. The knights then rose from their knees, took their swords, and wet the rivets with water, so as to fix the blade firmly in the hilt. Then they all stole stealthily and cautiously towards Shuten. Oji. No longer the timid mountain priests, clad in full armor, they were transformed into avenging warriors. With flashing eyes and dauntless mien, they moved across the room. The captive princesses standing round realized that these men were deliverers from their beloved capital. Their joy and wonder cannot be put into words. Some cried aloud with joy, others covered their faces with their sleeves and burst into soft weeping. Others raised their hands to heaven and exclaimed, "Uda come to hell! Surely these brave men will kill the demons and set us free." And with clasped hands, they entreated the knights to slay their captors and take them back to their homes. Now, Reiko stood over the sleeping Shuten Doji with draw, sword, and raising it on high with a mighty sweep, he aimed at the demon's neck, which was as big round as a barrel. The head was severed from the body at one blow, but horrible to relate. Instead of falling to the ground, it flew up into the air in a great rage. It hung over Reiko for a moment, snorting flames of fire, and then swooped down as if it would bite off the warrior's head. But it was daunted by the glittering star on his helmet, and drew back and gazed in surprise eyes at the transformed man. Reiko was scorched by the demon's flaming breath. Once more he raised his long sword, and striking the terrible head brought it to the ground at last. The noise of the combat and the triumphant shouts of the warriors woke the other demons, who roused themselves as quickly as their stupefied senses allowed them. They were in a great fright, and without waiting to get their iron clubs, they made a rush upon Reiko. But they were too late. His 5 braves dashed in and attacked them right and left, until in a few minutes there was not one left to tell the tale of the destruction which had come down upon them like the autumn whirlwind upon the leaves of the forest glades. Captive princesses went. They saw that their captors were all slain, jumped about with gladness, waving their long sleeves to and fro, as the tears of joy streamed down their pale faces. They ran to Reiko and caught hold of his sleeves and praised him, saying, "Oh, Reiko-sama, what a brave and noble knight you are. We are indeed grateful to you for having saved our lives. Never have we seen such a wonderful warrior." With many such expressions of joy, they gathered round the knight, and their merry voices were now heard, instead of the groans of the dying cannibals. Now that Shuten Doji was vanquished with all his horde, the way was quite open for Reiko and his men to take the fair captives away from the castle of horror and make their way back to the capital as soon as possible. First of all, Reiko tied up the head of Shuten Doji with a strong rope and told the 5 brave knights to carry it. Then, followed by the princesses, the little band left Mount Oi forever and set out on the homeward journey. When they reached Kyoto, the news of Reiko's return spread like fire, and the people came out in crowds to welcome the heroes. When the parents of the long-lost damsels saw their daughters again, they felt as if they must be dreaming. It seemed too good to be true that the dear and cherished ones should be restored to them safe and well, and they overwhelmed Reiko with praise and with precious gifts. Reiko took the head of Shuten Doji to the emperor and told him of all that had happened to him. You may be sure that, when His Majesty heard of the success which had crowned Reiko and his expedition, he awarded him great praise and merit, and bestowed upon him higher court rank than ever. In all the country, far and near, Reiko's name was in everyone's mouth, and he was acknowledged to be the greatest warrior in the land. Even in the lonely country places, there was not one poor farmer who did not know of the brave deeds of the great general. Ever since then, his portrait is familiar to the boys of Japan, for it is often painted on their kites. Kitamaru the robber, Reiko the brave, and the goblin spider. You have just read of the brave knight Reiko's exploits at Oyayama, and how he rid the country of the demons who haunted the city of Kyoto and terrified the inhabitants of the flower capital, as that city was sometimes called by their terrible deeds. There are other interesting stories about him. and his fearless warrior attainers, which you may like to hear. It was not long after Reiko's exploits at Oyayama that the country rang with the name of Kitamaru, a robber and highwayman, who, by his notorious deeds of cruelty and robber, had caused his name to be feared and hated by all, both young and old. One evening Reiko with his attendants was returning home from a day's hunting when he happened to pass the house of his younger brother Yorinabu. The warrior had had a long day out, and having still a good distance to ride before he would reach his own house, the thought of a good meal and friendly company, just then, when he was tired and very hungry, was pleasant to contemplate in the lonely hour of twilight. So he called a halt outside the house and sent in word to his brother that he, Reiko, was passing by, and that if Yorinabu had any refreshment to offer his brother, he would call in and stay the night there, as he was tired. But on his way back from a day's hunt, now in Japan, an elder brother or sister commands respect from the younger members of the family. And so Yorinabu was very pleased that Reiko, his elder brother, had condescended to call upon him. A servant soon returned with the message that Yorinabu was only too pleased to receive Reiko, that he had ordered a feast to be prepared that evening in honor of an unusual event. And as he was alone, nothing could be more opportune or give him greater joy than that his elder brother should have chanced to come by. He humbly begged Reiko that he would deign to share the feast, such as it was, and to pardon the poorness of his hospitality. Reiko was very pleased with his brother's gracious reception. He quickly flung the reins to his groom, dismounted from his horse, and entered the house, wondering what could be the occasion of Yorinabu's ordering a banquet for himself. When the warrior was shown into the room, he found Yorinabu seated on the mats drinking sake as the servants were bringing in the first dishes of the dinner. When the salutations were over, Yorinabu handed Reiko his wine cup. Reiko took it, and having drained it, asked what his brother meant by the feast he had promised him, and what was the occasion of it. Yorinabu laughed as if with triumph, and wheeling round on his cushion, pointed out into the garden. Reiko then looked in the direction indicated by his brother's hand, and saw, tied up to a large pine tree, a young man who could not be much over 30 and of extraordinary strength. The face of the captive expressed hate and ferocity. His body was of an enormous build, while his arms and legs are like trunks of pine trees, so large and brown and muscular were they. His hair was a rough and matted shock, and the eyes glared as if they would start from their sockets. Indeed, to Reiko, the wild creature looked more like a demon than a human being. "Well, Yorinabu," said Reiko, "the occasion of your feast is to say the least unusual. It must certainly have given you some sport to catch that wild creature. But tell me who he is that you have got tied up out there." "Have you not heard of Kitamaru, the notorious robber?" answered Yorinabu. "There he is. One of my men captured him out on the hills. He found him asleep. The town has long been clamoring for him. He has a big score to see. It'll at last. For tonight I intend to keep him tied up like that, and tomorrow I shall hand him over to the law. Come, let us be merry, for the dinner is served." Reiko clapped his hands when he heard of the great feat Yorinabu and his men had accomplished in catching the fearful robber, the terror of whose lawless deeds had long held the people of Kyoto trembling with fear and dread. The outlaw Kitamaru was caught at last, and by his own brother Yorinabu. This was an event of rejoicing and congratulation for the family. "You have certainly done a meritorious service to your country," said he, "but it is ridiculous to tie such a creature up with a rope only. You might just as well think of tying up a wild cow with a fine kite string. It would be less dangerous. Take my advice, Yorinabu, put a strong iron chain round him, or the murderer will soon be at large again." Yorinabu thought his brother's advice wise, so he clapped his hands. When the servant came to answer the summons, he ordered him to bring an iron chain. When this was brought, he went into the garden, followed by Reiko and his men, and wound it round Kitamaru's body several times, secure. Ring it at last to a post with a padlock. Kitamaru up to this time had rejoiced at his light bonds. He was so strong that he knew he could easily break a rope, and he had waited but for the nightfall to make good his escape under cover of the darkness. You can imagine how great was his anger at Reiko's interference, which was the cause of his being treated with so much severity that his projected escape would now be difficult. "Hateful man," muttered Kitamaru to himself. "I will surely punish you for what you have done to me. Remember." And he threw evil glances at Reiko. But the brave warrior cared little for the wild robber's malignant glances. He only laughed when he noticed them, and as the chain was drawn tighter round the robber, he said, "That's right, that chain will hold him sure enough. You must run no risk of his escaping this time." Then he and Yorinabu returned to the house, and dinner was served and the two brothers made merry the whole evening, talking over old times, and it was late before they retired to rest. Now Kitamaru knew that Reiko slept in Yorinabu's house, and he made up his mind to try to slay him that night, for he was mad with wrath at what Reiko had done to him. "He shall see what I can do," growled Kitamaru to himself, shaking his rough and shaggy head like a big, long-haired terrier. He waited quietly till everyone in the house had gone to rest and all was silent. Then Kitamaru arose, cramped and stiff from sitting tied up so long. With a mighty effort, he flung out his great arms, laughing defiance at the chain that bound him. So great was his strength that no second effort was needed. The chain broke and fell clanking to the ground at once, and Kitamaru, like a large hound, shook himself free from his bonds. Softly as a mouse, he approached the house and climbed onto the roof, and with one tremendous blow from his huge fist, he broke through the tiles and the boards to the ceiling. His plan was to jump down upon Reiko while he lay sleeping, and taking him unawares suddenly to cut off his head. But the warrior had lain down to rest expecting such an attack, and he had slept but lightly. As soon as he heard the noise above him, he was wide awake in an instant, and to warn his enemy he coughed and cleared his throat. Kitamaru was a man of fierce and dauntless character, and he was not in the least thrown back in his purpose by finding that Reiko was awake. He went on with his work of making a hole large enough in the ceiling to let himself through to the room beneath. Reiko now sat up and clapped his hands loudly to summon his men who slept in an adjoining room. Watanabe, the chief man-at-arms, came out to see what his master wanted. "Watanabe," said Reiko, "my sleep has been disturbed by something moving in the ceiling. It may be a weasel." "Well, for weasels are noisy creatures. It cannot be a rat, for a rat is not large enough to make so much noise. At any rate, it seems impossible to sleep tonight, so saddle the horses and get all the men ready to start. I will get up and ride out to the temple of Mount Kurama. I want all the men to accompany me." Perched between the roof and the ceiling, the robber heard all this and said to himself, "What ho, Reiko goes to Kurama. That is good news, instead of wasting my time here like a rat in a trap. I will set out for Kurama immediately and get there before those stupid men can, and I will waylay them and kill them all." So Kitamaru crawled out on the roof again, let himself down to the ground, and hurried with all the speed he could make to Kurama. Large plain had to be crossed in going from the city to Kurama, and here a number of wild cattle had their home. When Kitamaru, on his way to Kurama, came to this spot, a plan flashed across his mind by which he could steal a march on Reiko. He soon caught one of the big oxen a blow on the head. 3 blows one after the other, and the ox fell dead at the robber's feet. Kitamaru then proceeded to strip off its skin. It was very hard work, but he managed to do it quickly, so strong was he. And then throwing the hide over himself, he lay down completely disguised, man in a bull's hide, and waiting for Reiko and his men to come. He had not long to wait. Reiko, followed by his 4 braves, soon came in sight. The warrior reined in his horse when he came to the plain and saw the cattle. He turned to his men and said, "Here is a place where we may find some sport. Instead of going on to Kurama, let us stay here and have some hunting. Look at the wild cattle." The 4 retainers with one accord all gladly agreed to their chief's proposal, for they loved sport and adventure just as much as Reiko, and were glad of an excuse to show their skill as huntsmen. The sun was just rising, and the prospect of a fine morning added zest to the pastime. Each man prepared his bow and arrows in readiness to begin the chase, but the cattle, thus disturbed, did not enjoy the sport. Man's play was their death indeed. One of their number had been killed by Kitamaru, and now they were attacked by Reiko and his men, who came riding furiously into their midst, shooting at them with bows and arrows. With angry snorts, whisking their tails on high and butting with their horns, they ran to right and left. In the general stampede that followed their attack, the hunters noticed that one animal lay still in the tall grass. At first, they thought it must be either lame or ill, so they took no notice of it and left it alone till Reiko came riding up. He went up and looked at it carefully, and then ordered one of his men to shoot it. The man obeyed, and taking his bow, shot an arrow at the recumbent animal. The arrow did not hit the mark, for, to the astonishment of the 4 hunters, the hide was flung aside and out stepped the robber Kitamaru. "You, Reiko, it is." "Who is it?" exclaimed he. "Do you know that I have a spite against you?" And with these words he darted forward and attacked Reiko with a dagger. But Reiko did not even move in his saddle. He drew his sword and, adroitly guarding himself, exchanged 2 or 3 strokes with the robber, and then slashed off his head. But wonderful to relate, so strong was the will that animated Kitamaru that though his head was cut off, his body stood up straight and firm till his right arm, still holding the dagger, struck at Reiko's saddle. Then, and not till then, it collapsed. It is said that the warriors were all greatly impressed by the malevolent spirit of the robber, which was strong enough to stir the body to action even after the head had been severed from the shoulders. Such was the death of the notorious robber Kitamaru, at the hands of the brave warrior Reiko, who was awarded much praise for the clever way in which he drew Kitamaru out as far as Kuram. To kill him, he had understood from Kitamaru's evil glances that the robber planned to kill him, and he thus avoided causing trouble in his brother's house. In this instance, as always, Reiko displayed wisdom and bravery. No sooner, however, was Kitamaru killed, the news was brought to the capital that another man had arisen who imitated Kitamaru in his daily deeds of robbery and other wicked acts. This robber's name was Kakamadare. One bright moonlight night, Amadare was waiting on the plain between Kyoto and Kurama for travelers to come that way, hoping that luck would bring some rich man into his clutches. Presently, he heard someone coming towards him playing on a flute. Thinking this, what's strange, he hid himself in the grass and waited to see who would appear. The sweet music drew nearer and nearer, and then the player came in view. The light of the moon made everything as clear as day, and the robber saw a handsome samurai. He of soldierly aspect, dressed in beautiful silken robes and wearing a long sword at his side. "Now's my opportunity. I'm in luck tonight," thought the robber, as he rose from his hiding place and stealthily followed the flute player. As he kept step by step behind him, Kakamadare drew his sword in readiness several times to cut down his prey and waited for the chance to strike. All at once, the samurai turned and looked steadily at the robber, who began to tremble. Then the knight calmly and coolly resumed his playing, as if utterly indifferent to the danger which threatened him. Once more the robber followed, with the intention of cutting the man down, but the opportunity for which he waited never came. Each time his hand went up with his sword, it as quickly fell to his side. A spirit of high and noble purpose seemed to emanate from the knight, which cowed the man behind and made him weak. For so great is the virtue of the sword that in Japan it is an acknowledged fact that all noble swordsmen had this power of subduing lesser natures by the spiritual grace which went forth from them. Indeed, the belief in the occult power of the sword was great, and it was said that no bad man could keep the possession of a fine blade. Kakamadare could not strike. He could not tell the cause of his weakness. He thought that it might be the influence of the music. He found himself listening to the gentle strains of the flute and admiring the skill with which the man played. He noticed the firm and fearless air of the knight as he walked and his great nerve. The man knew himself to be followed by a robber, yet he showed not the least concern. Kakamade tried to turn back now, but he found that he could do nothing but follow the man in front of him. In this way the strange pair reached the town. Kakamade now made a great effort to break the spell, and was on the point of turning back and trying to escape from a strange, compelling presence, when to his astonishment, the samurai suddenly wheeled round upon him and said, "Kakamade, I thank you for your trouble. You have given me a safe escort." At this, the robber became so terrified that he fell down on his knees and was unable to move or speak for some moments. At last, so soon as his tongue found utterance, he said, "I know not who you are, but I beg you to forgive me. I would have killed you." He then confessed everything to the knight. He told him of his many deeds of robbery and violence, which had made him feared and hated by the people, who thought that he must be a demon, for so cruel and relentless was he that he never showed mercy even to the poorest peasant. "I have never met anyone like you," Kakamade went on to say. "I promise to give up my life as a robber, and I beg you to take me into your service as one of the humblest of your retainers." The knight led the man home and gave him some good clothes, telling him that when he again got into straits and wanted money or clothes, he might come a second time to the house, but that it was unwise to show such contempt for others as to enter into a encounter where he himself might be the injured party. This kindness and mercy touched the man's heart, and from that day he became a reformed man and a law-abiding citizen. The knight was none other than Hirai, one of the warriors who accompanied Reiko in his successful expedition against the demons of Oyayama. There is a saying that brave generals make brave soldiers, and it is quite true. Reiko was a man of great sagacity and courage, and his band of braves and the knight Hirai, of whom we have just read, were like their master. There were no men in the whole of Japan braver than they. This proves the truth of the old adage. There is another story about the General Reiko which you may like to hear. The sword with which Reiko slew Kitamaru was called the Kumakiri, or spider-cutting sword, and about the naming of this blade there is an interesting story. It happened at one time that Reiko was unwell and was obliged to keep his room. Every night at about 12 a little acolyte would come to his bedside, and in a kind and gentle way pour out and give him some medicine to take. Reiko noticed that he did not know the boy, but as there were many underlings in the servants' quarters whom he never saw, this did not strike him as strange. But Reiko, instead of recovering, found himself growing weaker and weaker, and especially after taking the medicine he always felt worse. At last one day he spoke to his head servant and asked him who it was that brought him medicine every night, but the attendant answered that he knew nothing about the medicine, and that there was no acolyte in the house. Reiko now suspected some supernatural snare. Some malevolent being is taking advantage of my illness and trying to bewitch me, or to cause my death. When the boy comes again tonight, I will find out his real form. He may be a fox or goblin in disguise, said Reiko. So he waited for the appearance of the acolyte, wondering what the strange incident could mean. When midnight came, the boy, as usual, appeared, bringing with him the usual cup of medicine. The knight calmly took the cup from the boy and said, "Thank you for your rubble," but instead of swallowing the false medicine, he threw it, cup and all, at the boy's head. Then, jumping up, he seized the sword that lay beside his bed and cut at the impostor. As the blade fell, the acolyte screamed with rage and pain. Then, with a movement as quick as lightning, before he turned to escape from the room, he threw something at the knight, which, marvelous to relate as he threw, spread outwards pyramidically into a large white sticky web which fell over Reiko and clung to him so that he could hardly move. Reiko whirled his sword round and cut the clinging meshes and freed himself. Again the goblin threw a web over him, and again Reiko cut the enmeshing threads away. Once more the huge spider's web, for such it was thrown over him, and then the goblin fled. Reiko called for his men and then sank exhausted on his bed. His chief retainer, answering the summons, met the acolyte in the corridor and thinking it strange that an unknown priest, however young, should come from his master's room at that hour of the night, stopped him with drawn sword. The goblin answered not a word, but threw his entangling web over the man and mysteriously disappeared, now thorough. He alarmed, the retainer hastened to Reiko. Great was his consternation when he saw his master, with the meshes of the goblin's web still clinging to him. "See," exclaimed Reiko, pointing to the threads still clinging to his man and himself. "Again. Oblin's spider has been here." He then gave orders to hunt down the goblin, but the thing could nowhere be found. On the white mats and along the corridors, they found, as they searched, red drops of blood, which showed that the creature had been wounded. Reiko's men followed the red trail, out into the garden, across the city to the hills, till they came to a cave, and here the blood drops ceased. Groans and cries of pain issued from the cave, so the warriors felt sure that they had come to the end of their hunt. "The goblin is surely hiding in that cave," they all said. Drawing their swords, they entered the cave and found a monster spider writhing with pain and bleeding from a deep sword cut on the head. They at once killed the creature and carried it to Reiko. The knight had often heard stories of these dreadful spiders, but had never seen one before. It was this goblin spider then that wanted to prey upon me. The net that was thrown over me was a spider's web of all my adventures. This is the strangest, said Reiko. That night, Reiko ordered a banquet to be prepared for all his retainers in honor of the event, and he drank to the health of his 5 brave men. From that time, the acolyte never appeared, and Reiko recovered his health and strength at once. Such is the story of the Kumakiri sword. Kumo means spider, and kiri means cutting, and it was so named because it cut to death the goblin spider who haunted the brave knight Reiko.